The dinner plate shattered against the kitchen wall, sending fragments of ceramic across the tile floor like confetti celebrating the end of my marriage. Tyler stood in the doorway, his face twisted with the kind of rage I'd learned to recognize over the past year. His expensive suit wrinkled from another long day at the office that probably wasn't spent at the office at all. The smell of the burnt lasagna I'd attempted to salvage still hung in the air, a testament to my exhaustion after working a 12-hour shift at the medical clinic where I served as head nurse. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is pathetic, Rachel, Tyler snarled, gesturing at the mess on the floor and the smoking remains of dinner. 5 years of marriage, and you still can't manage something as basic as a decent meal. My mother was right about you from the beginning. I stood frozen by the kitchen island, my scrubs still damp with the sweat of a day spent caring for others, watching my husband transform into someone I barely recognized. The Tyler I'd married had been gentle, supportive, proud of my career and understanding when work ran late. This man before me seemed like a stranger wearing my husband's face. I worked until 9 tonight, Tyler, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. Mrs. Patterson had complications after her surgery, and I couldn't leave until I knew she was stable. I tried to save dinner, but the oven timer malfunctioned. His laugh was cold, bitter, nothing like the warm sound I'd fallen in love with during our college years at UConn. Always an excuse. Always work first, marriage second. Do you know what normal wives do, Rach? They prioritize their families. They have dinner ready when their husbands come home. They don't expect their men to survive on takeout and frozen dinners. Normal wives, I repeated, tasting the words like something sour. You mean wives like your mother, who never worked a day outside the home because your father made sure she never had to? Tyler's eyes flashed dangerously. Don't you dare talk about my parents. At least they understand what commitment means. At least my mother knows how to take care of her family. The comparison stung because Patricia Brooks had made it clear from our engagement that she considered me inadequate for her precious son. Every family gathering became a subtle competition where I was measured against an impossible standard. Patricia's pot roasts were legendary, her holiday spreads worthy of magazine covers, her home always immaculate, despite having raised 3 children. She'd never worked outside the home, dedicating herself entirely to being the perfect wife and mother, a role she clearly believed I was failing at miserably. Your mother didn't have student loans to pay off, I said, my voice rising slightly. She didn't work 60-hour weeks to help build a life with her husband. She married into money, Tyler. I married into debt and dreams, remember? Tyler stepped closer, his presence suddenly intimidating in a way that made me take an unconscious step backward. Here's what's going to happen, Rachel. You're going to make a choice. Either you quit that job and start acting like a real wife, or you can pack your bags and leave, cook or leave. It's that simple. The ultimatum hung between us like a guillotine blade, sharp and fine. Tyler had been building toward this moment for months, I realized. The complaints about takeout dinners had escalated to arguments about my work schedule. The passive-aggressive comments about other wives had become direct attacks on my priority. Now he was demanding I choose between the career I'd built over 8 years and our marriage. You want me to quit my job, I said slowly, making sure I understood. You want me to give up the profession I love, the patients who depend on me, the income that pays for half our mortgage, so I can stay home and make sure your dinner is ready at 6 every night. I want you to act like my wife instead of a stranger who happens to sleep in my bed, Tyler shot back. When was the last time we had a real conversation? When was the last time you cooked a meal without burning it? When was the last time you showed any interest in my life, my work, my needs? The accusations felt like physical blows, each one hitting a vulnerable spot I'd been trying to protect. It was true that our conversations had become limited to scheduling and logistics. It was true that I'd been too exhausted most evenings to do much more than collapse on the couch with a frozen dinner. But the idea that I'd stopped caring about Tyler's life was so far from reality, it took my breath away. I ask about your work every day, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You're the one who stopped answering. You're the one who started staying late without explanation. You're the one who stopped touching me, stopped kissing me, good night, stopped acting like we were partners instead of roommates. Tyler's face hardened. Maybe I stopped trying because there was nothing left to fight for. Maybe I got tired of competing with your job for your attention. Maybe I realized I married a woman who cares more about her patients than her husband. The words struck deep, finding the guilt I'd been carrying for months. There had been nights when I'd chosen to stay late with a patient, rather than come home to Tyler's cold silence. There had been weekends when I'd volunteered for extra shifts rather than face another awkward dinner where we had nothing to say to each other. But I'd told myself I was working for our future, saving money for the house renovations we'd planned, building my reputation for the promotion I was hoping to receive. Give me some time to think, I said finally, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ear. Tyler's smile was triumphant, cruel. You have until Sunday. That's 3 days, Rachel. 3 days to decide what matters more to you. And if you choose to stay, I want to see some real changes. No more 60-hour weeks. No more emergency calls during family dinner. No more putting everyone else's needs before mine. He stepped over the broken pieces of the dinner plate and walked toward the stairs, pausing only to add, "Clean this mess up. I'm going to watch the game." I stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the debris of our marriage and the ruins of a dinner I'd tried so hard to perfect, despite my exhaustion. The silence felt heavy, oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of the television upstairs and the gentle hum of the refrigerator. 3 days to choose between the career that defined me and the marriage I'd thought would last forever. But as I knelt to collect the broken pieces of ceramic, something inside me began to shift. Tyler's ultimatum had revealed something I'd been too afraid to acknowledge. This wasn't about dinner or work schedules or competing priorities. This was about control, about reducing me to a role that would make him comfortable, about erasing the independent woman he'd claimed to love when we met. The next morning, I woke before dawn with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. Tyler had already left for his early golf game with his father, a Saturday routine that had become sacred over the past year. I made coffee in the quiet kitchen, stepping carefully around the spot where I'd swept up the broken plate, and allowed myself to really think about what my life had become. Tyler Brooks and I had met during our junior year at the University of Connecticut, in a psychology class we'd both taken as an elective. He'd been charming, ambitious, working toward his business degree with plans to join his father's investment firm. I'd been focused on my pre-nursing requirements, already knowing I wanted to spend my life helping people heal. Our differences had seemed complementary then, his business acumen balancing my compassionate nature, his family's stability offering security I'd never known growing up with a single mother, who worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat. Tyler had been proud of my career goals during our dating year. He'd study with me through my nursing school finals, bring me coffee during my clinical rotations, brag to his friends about his girlfriend who was saving lives. When he proposed during my final semester, kneeling in the hospital parking lot after I'd finished a particularly difficult shift in the ICU, I'd felt like the luckiest woman alive. The first year of marriage had been an adjustment period we'd both expected. Tyler was establishing himself at Brooks Investment Group, working long hours to prove himself worthy of eventually taking over from his father. I was navigating my first job as a registered nurse at Millbrook Medical Center, learning to balance the emotional weight of patient care with the technical demands of hospital protocol. We'd been tired most evenings, but we'd been tired together, supporting each other through the challenges of building our careers. When had that support turned into competition? When had Tyler started viewing my dedication to nursing as a threat to our relationship rather than an integral part of who I was? I tried to pinpoint the exact moment, but the change had been gradual, like water slowly wearing away stone until suddenly there was a canyon where there had once been solid ground. The first real crack had appeared about 18 months ago, when I'd been offered the position of head nurse in the cardiac unit. The promotion meant longer hours, more responsibility and significantly more pay. Tyler had smiled and congratulated me, but something in his eyes had shifted. He'd started making comments about other couples we knew, pointing out how the wives had scaled back their careers after marriage, how they prioritized family time over professional advancement. "Jennifer Walsh only works part-time now," he'd mentioned one evening, referring to a woman from his office, whose husband was also at Brooks Investment Group. She said it's made all the difference in their marriage. Brad comes home to a clean house and a home-cooked meal every night. I'd brushed off the comment then, thinking Tyler was just processing his own career stress, but the observations had continued, subtle at first, then increasingly pointed. Patricia Brooks had been recruited as an ally in this campaign, making seemingly innocent remarks about how different things were in her generation, how she'd always put Gerald's career first because that's what wives did. The pressure had been gradual but relentless. Tyler had started comparing me to wives whose entire identity revolved around supporting their husbands, women who'd given up their own ambitions to become perfect domestic partners. When I'd gotten home late from the hospital, exhausted from dealing with medical emergencies and life-or-death decisions, Tyler would be waiting with examples of what other wives had accomplished during their days at home. Patricia Collins organized the entire charity fundraiser for the Children's Hospital, he'd say, referring to one of his mother's friends, raised $60,000. That's the kind of thing you could do if you had more time. The implication was always clear: my career was selfish, a distraction from my real purpose as his wife. The fact that my work directly helped save lives somehow mattered less than my failure to have dinner ready when Tyler walked through the door. The money I contributed to our household, nearly 40% of our combined income, was dismissed as unnecessary since Tyler's salary could theoretically support us both. But it wasn't just about the money, and we both knew. My job gave me identity, purpose, a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with my relationship with Tyler. When I walked into the cardiac unit each morning, I became someone whose skills and knowledge mattered, someone who could make a difference in the world. The thought of giving that up to become a full-time wife and eventual mother felt like losing myself entirely. As I sat in our kitchen that Saturday morning, watching the sun rise over the perfectly manicured lawn Tyler insisted on maintaining, I tried to imagine what my life would look like if I accepted his ultimatum. I would quit my job, probably volunteer for some appropriate charitable organization that wouldn't interfere with Tyler's schedule. I would learn to cook the elaborate meals Patricia Brooks was famous for, spend my days cleaning our house and running errands, have dinner ready at 6 regardless of what crisis might arise in Tyler's workday. The image felt suffocating, like trying to breathe underwater. This wasn't the life I'd dreamed of, wasn't the partnership I'd thought I was entering when I said yes to Tyler's proposal. Somewhere along the way, Tyler had decided that our marriage should mirror his parents' relationship, with him as the primary breadwinner and decision-maker and me as the supportive wife whose own dreams were secondary to his comfort. My phone buzzed with a text message from my colleague Jessica, who was covering my weekend shift at the hospital. "Mrs. Patterson is asking for you. She says you're the only nurse who really listens to her concerns about the pain medication." Patterson was 78 years old, recovering from heart surgery, frightened and alone since her husband had passed away 2 years earlier. She'd been my patient for the past week, and we'd developed the kind of connection that reminded me why I'd chosen nursing in the first place. She trusted me to advocate for her care, to ensure her concerns were heard by the doctors, to hold her hand during the frightening moments when the monitors beeped and she wasn't sure what was happening to her body. If I quit my job, Mrs. Patterson would become someone else's responsibility. The teenage boy recovering from a car accident, who'd told me I was the first adult to really hear him when he talked about his fears, would have to build trust with a different nurse. The young mother facing cancer treatment, who relied on me to explain procedures in terms she could understand, would lose an advocate who'd taken the time to learn about her family situation. But it wasn't just about the patients, though they mattered immensely. It was about the woman I'd worked so hard to become, the professional identity I'd built through years of education, training, and experience. Nursing wasn't just my job, it was my calling, the way I contributed to the world, the source of my confidence and self-respect. Tyler's ultimatum wasn't really about burnt dinners or work schedules. It was about power, about reducing me to a role that would make him feel more secure in his own identity. He wanted a wife who would reflect his success, validate his importance, make him feel like the center of someone's universe. The independent, accomplished woman he'd married had become a threat to that vision. The realization hit me like a physical blow, leaving me breathless with the magnitude of what I'd been slowly losing. For months I'd been apologizing for my career, making excuses for my passion, trying to shrink myself to fit into Tyler's increasingly narrow definition of what a wife should be. I'd been so focused on saving our marriage that I'd forgotten to save myself. I walked upstairs to our bedroom, standing in front of the full-length mirror that had reflected my image on our wedding day 5 years ago. The woman looking back at me now seemed smaller somehow, worn down by months of criticism and ultimatum. But underneath the exhaustion and doubt, I could still see traces of the confident young nurse who'd graduated at the top of her class, who'd chosen to spend her life helping others heal, who'd believed she could have both a successful career and a loving marriage. Tyler had given me 3 days to choose between my career and our marriage, but standing there in the quiet bedroom, surrounded by the life we'd built together, I realized he'd already made the choice for both of us. The Tyler who'd fallen in love with my ambition and dedication was gone, replaced by a man who saw those same qualities as defects to be corrected. The marriage I'd been fighting so hard to save had ended the moment Tyler decided I had to choose between being his wife and being myself. I just hadn't recognized it yet. My laptop sat on the desk by the window, and I opened it with hands that trembled slightly as I began to research divorce attorneys in the Hartford area. I wasn't ready to take that step yet, but I needed to understand my options, to know what my life might look like if I chose myself over Tyler's ultimatum. The search results showed several highly rated family law firms, but one name caught my attention: Victoria Hayes, described as specializing in high-conflict divorces involving professional women. Her website featured testimonials from clients who'd successfully protected their careers and assets during difficult separations. I bookmarked her information, not quite ready to make the call but knowing I might need to sit. Tyler returned from golf around noon, his cheeks flushed from the cool October air, and what I suspected was more than one drink at the clubhouse with his father. He seemed surprised to find me still in my pajamas, laptop open on the kitchen table. "Rough night?" he asked, his tone suggesting he thought I'd been crying over his ultimatum. "Just thinking," I replied, closing the laptop. "Did you have a good game?" Tyler's expression shifted, becoming guarded. "Fine. Dad and I talked about some business stuff. He thinks it's time for me to take on more responsibility at the firm." There was something in his voice, a defensiveness that made me look at him more closely. Gerald Brooks had been promising Tyler increased responsibility for years, always finding reasons to delay the transition. The Brooks Investment Group was Gerald's kingdom, and he seemed reluctant to share power even with his own son. "That's great," I said carefully. "What kind of increased responsibility?" Tyler turned away, opening the refrigerator and staring into it, as if the contents might reveal some hidden truth. "Just more client interaction, maybe some of the smaller accounts to start with." The vagueness bothered me, but I'd learned not to push when Tyler became evasive about work. His relationship with his father was complicated, filled with pressure to live up to impossible expectations, while being treated like a junior employee despite his business degree and 5 years of experience. "Are you hungry?" I asked, standing up from the table. "I could make sandwich." Tyler's laugh was sharp, reminded me of the broken plate from the night before. "Sandwiches, right, that's exactly what I mean, Rachel. Other wives are making roasts and casseroles, and you're offering sandwich." The criticism stung, but this time I felt something different underneath the hurt. Anger, maybe, or just exhaustion with the constant comparison to other women's domestic achievements. "I'm trying, Tyler. I worked 12 hours yesterday, and I'm tired." "You're always tired," he said, slamming the refrigerator door. "You're always working, always exhausted, always too busy for anything that matters to me." "Your dinner matters to me," I said, my voice rising slightly. "Our house matters to me." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You matter to me, but my work matters too, and I shouldn't have to apologize for that." Tyler stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Have you thought about what I said? About making a choice?" The question hung between us, and I realized this was my opportunity to tell him I'd been researching divorce attorneys, to explain that his ultimatum had revealed the fundamental incompatibility between us. Instead, I heard myself saying, "I'm still thinking." Tyler nodded, seeming satisfied with my answer. "Good. Take your time. But remember, Rachel, marriages require sacrifice. Real commitment means putting your partner's needs first sometimes." He left the kitchen then, heading upstairs to change clothes, and I stood alone trying to process what he'd said. Sacrifice. Commitment. Putting your partner's needs first. All concepts I understood and had practiced throughout our marriage, but somehow, in Tyler's interpretation, only my sacrifices counted. Only my commitment was questioned. Only my ability to put his needs first was found lacking. I thought about the sacrifices Tyler had made for our marriage, and realized I couldn't identify any. He'd never missed a golf game with his father for my work events. He'd never turned down business trips to support me through difficult periods at the hospital. He'd never compromised his career goals to accommodate my schedule or my dreams. The inequality was staggering once I really looked at it. For 5 years I'd been bending myself around Tyler's life, adjusting my schedule to accommodate his needs, apologizing for the demands of my career while never questioning the demands of his. I'd been so focused on being a good wife that I'd forgotten to ask whether Tyler was being a good husband. That evening, as we sat in our living room watching a movie Tyler had chosen, I studied his profile in the flickering light from the television. When had his jaw become so set, his expression so consistently dissatisfied? When had he stopped laughing at my jokes, stopped asking about my day with genuine interest, stopped seeing me as a partner rather than a problem to be solved? The man sitting next to me felt like a stranger, someone wearing my husband's face, but lacking his warmth, his curiosity, his respect for my independence. Maybe Tyler was right that marriages required sacrifice. Maybe he was even right that I hadn't been the wife he wanted me to be, but I was beginning to understand that the wife he wanted wasn't someone I could become without losing everything that made me who I was. The next morning was Sunday, Tyler's deadline for my decision. I woke before him, slipping out of bed to make coffee and sit in the pre-dawn quiet of our kitchen. Through the window I could see the Brooks family home across the street, a massive colonial, where Patricia and Gerald had raised their children, and where Sunday dinners were still mandatory events for the extended family. In a few hours Tyler and I would walk across that street for Patricia's famous pot roast, served precisely at 2 o'clock with homemade rolls and vegetables from her garden. The meal would be perfect. The conversation would revolve around Gerald's business successes and Tyler's prospects, and I would be subtly reminded of all the ways I failed to measure up to the Brooks family standard. Patricia would ask pointed questions about my work schedule, suggesting with maternal concern that I seemed tired lately. Gerald would make comments about the importance of family stability and building a successful career, glancing meaningfully at Tyler as if to suggest that a distracted husband couldn't perform at his best. Tyler would sit quietly through these exchanges, neither defending me nor acknowledging that his parents' constant criticism might be contributing to the strain in our marriage. As I sat in the morning silence, I realized I couldn't face another Sunday dinner filled with passive-aggressive attacks on my career and my worth as a wife. I couldn't pretend everything was fine while Tyler's family systematically undermined my confidence and his respect for me. Most importantly, I couldn't give Tyler the answer he was expecting, the surrender he'd demanded in exchange for a peace that would require me to abandon everything I'd worked to become. My phone rang, interrupting my thought. The caller ID showed Millbrook Medical Center, and my heart jumped with concern for my patients. "Rachel, I'm so sorry to bother you on your day off," said Dr. Martinez, the head of our cardiac unit. "We have a situation with Mrs. Patterson. She's refusing to take her medication, says she'll only talk to you. I know it's your weekend, but could you possibly come in for an hour, just to calm her down and get her back on track with treatment?" Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who'd been asking for me yesterday, the patient who trusted me, who relied on me to advocate for her care and explain what was happening to her body. Dr. Martinez was asking me to come in on my day off, to prioritize a patient's needs over my personal time. Exactly the kind of dedication to my career that Tyler had been criticized. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, I said without hesitation. Tyler appeared in the kitchen as I was gathering my keys and purse, his expression immediately shifting to the familiar irritation I'd learned to dread. "Where are you going?" "We have dinner at my parents' in a few hours," the hospital called. "Mrs. Patterson is having complications and she's asking for me specifically. I'll be back in time for dinner." Tyler's face darkened. "Are you serious right now? It's Sunday, Rachel. It's supposed to be our day together, our family time. Can't someone else handle one patient?" The question revealed everything about the gulf between us. Tyler couldn't understand that Mrs. Patterson wasn't just one patient, but a frightened elderly woman who'd placed her trust in me. He couldn't see that my willingness to come in on my day off wasn't about choosing work over family but about honoring the responsibility I'd accepted when I became a nurse. "She's scared, Tyler. She doesn't trust anyone else right now, and if she won't take her medication, she could have serious complications." "And what about my needs?" Tyler's voice rose. "What about our marriage?" "This is exactly what I'm talking about, Rach. You'll drop everything for a stranger, but you can't even commit to staying home for your own husband." The accusation was so unfair, so blind to the reality of what my job entailed, that I felt something snap inside me. Mrs. Patterson isn't a stranger. She's a person who needs help, and I have the skills to help her. "That's not a betrayal of our marriage, Tyler. That's who I am." "Then maybe that's the problem," Tyler shot back. "Maybe who you are isn't compatible with being married to me." The words hung in the air between us, and I realized Tyler had just given me the answer I'd been searching for. Not the ultimatum he'd intended, but a moment of clarity that cut through months of confusion and self-doubt. "Maybe you're right," I said quietly. Tyler's expression shifted, surprise replacing anger. "What?" "Maybe who I am isn't compatible with being married to you. Maybe the problem isn't that I'm a bad wife, but that we want different things from marriage." I walked toward the door, pausing only to look back at Tyler one more time. "I'm going to help Mrs. Patterson. When I get back, we need to talk." The drive to the hospital felt different somehow, as if I was moving towards something instead of running away. Miss Patterson's face lit up when she saw me, and the relief in her eyes reminded me why I'd chosen this profession, why no amount of criticism or ultimatums could make me abandon the calling that defined me. "I knew you'd come," she said, reaching for my hand. "I told them you'd understand." As I sat with Mrs. Patterson, explaining her medication schedule and listening to her fears about going home alone, I felt the last pieces of my marriage to Tyler Brooks falling away. Not with sadness or regret, but with the quiet certainty that comes from finally understanding what you're not willing to sacrifice. When I returned home 3 hours later, Tyler was waiting in the living room, still dressed for Sunday dinner at his parents' house. His expression was expectant, as if he believed my absence had somehow proven his point about my misplaced priorities. "How was your patient?" he asked, the words dripping with sarcasm. "She's stable now, ready to continue her treatment." Tyler nodded, standing up from the couch. "Good. Now we can focus on our conversation. Have you made your decision, Rachel?" I looked at my husband, really looked at him, seeing clearly for the first time in months the man he'd become. The ultimatum, the constant criticism, the demand that I choose between my career and our marriage, it had all been leading to this moment. "Yes," I said, "I have." Tyler's face went through a series of expressions as he processed my words. First confusion, then something that looked almost like relief, followed quickly by the anger I'd learned to recognize over the past year. "What exactly does that mean, Rachel? You've made your decision." I set my purse down on the coffee table, taking a moment to center myself before delivering the words that would change everything. "It means I'm not quitting my job, Tyler. It means I'm choosing to remain the woman you fell in love with, even if that's not the woman you want me to be now." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Tyler ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd once found endearing, but now recognized as a sign of his growing frustration with anything that didn't go according to his plan. "So you're choosing your job over our marriage," he said finally, his voice flat and cold. "I'm choosing myself over your ultimatum," I corrected. "There's a difference." Tyler's laugh was bitter, familiar. "Right, because everything is always about you, isn't it, Rach? Your career, your patience, your need to feel important. What about what I need? What about what our marriage needs. The accusation stung because part of me had been wondering the same thing for months. Had I been selfish? Had I prioritized my career over my marriage? But sitting with Miss Patterson that afternoon, holding her hand while she expressed her fears about living alone, I'd remembered something crucial about who I was and why my work mattered. What does our marriage need, Tyler? I asked, because I thought it needed two people who respected each other, supported each other's dreams, and worked together as partners. But apparently what you need is a wife who gives up everything that makes her who she is, to become your vision of what a woman should be. Tyler's face flushed red. That's not fair. I've supported your career for 5 years. You supported it when it was convenient for you, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. When my schedule didn't interfere with your dinner plans or your parents' expectations. But the moment my success started making you uncomfortable, the moment other people started questioning why your wife worked such long hours, you decided my career was the problem. Other people don't question anything, Tyler snapped. I question why my wife cares more about strangers than her own husband. The words hit their intended target, but instead of the guilt I'd felt for months, I experienced something new: clarity. Tyler's accusation revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had been poisoning our marriage. He saw my dedication to nursing as a betrayal of him, rather than an expression of the values and purpose that had shaped me long before we met. I don't care more about strangers than you, I said quietly. I care about both. But you're asking me to prove my love by destroying the person you claim to love. That doesn't make sense, Tyler. Tyler paced to the window, staring out at his parents' house across the street. The afternoon light caught the tension in his shoulders, and for a moment I remembered the young man I'd married, the one who'd been proud of my accomplishments instead of threatened by them. Mom's expecting us for dinner, he said without turning around. The change of subject felt like whiplash, but I recognized it as Tyler's way of avoiding conversations that made him uncomfortable. Patricia Brooks had been making Sunday dinners for her family since before Tyler was born, and missing one was considered a serious breach of family protocol. I know, I said. Are you going to tell them about your ultimatum? Tyler turned back to me, his expression guarded. What's to tell? You made your choice. We'll deal with the consequences. There was something ominous in his tone, a suggestion that consequences were already being planned. I thought about Patricia's constant criticism of my career, Gerald's pointed comments about family stability, and the way both Tyler's parents seemed to view my independence as a character flaw that needed correction. Tyler, have you been discussing our marriage with your parents? His hesitation told me everything I needed to know before he spoke. They're concerned about us, about the strain your work is putting on our relationship. The strain my work is putting on our relationship, I repeated slowly. Not the strain of unrealistic expectations or constant criticism, just my work. They care about me, Rachel. They want to see me happy, and they think I'm the obstacle to your happiness. Tyler's silence was answer enough. The realization that my in-laws had been actively working to undermine my marriage felt like a physical blow. I'd spent 5 years trying to earn Patricia's approval, accepting her subtle criticism as motherly concern, telling myself that Gerald's comments about traditional family roles were just generational differences. Now I understood that their disapproval hadn't been passive judgment but active interference. How long have they been telling you I was wrong for you? I asked. Tyler shifted uncomfortably. They never said you were wrong for me. They just think marriage requires compromise, and that maybe you haven't been willing to compromise enough. The careful phrasing told me these weren't Tyler's words, but his parents, repeated so often he'd begun to believe. I wondered how many of our recent arguments had been influenced by Patricia's opinions about what wives should prioritize, how many of Tyler's complaints about my cooking had echoed his mother's casual observations about my domestic failures. What kind of compromises have you made, Tyler? I asked. What have you given up for our marriage? The question seemed to catch him off guard. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, searching for an answer that apparently didn't exist. I work hard to provide for us, he said finally. You work hard because you love your career and you're ambitious. That's not a compromise, Tyler. That's pursuing your own goals. Everything I do is for our future, he insisted. Everything you do is for your future, I correct. A future where I fit into a very vific role that has nothing to do with who I actually am. Tyler's expression hardened again, the brief vulnerability disappearing behind familiar defensiveness. You know what, Rachel? Maybe you're right. Maybe we do want different things. Maybe this marriage was a mistake from the beginning. The words should have devastated me, but instead, I felt an unexpected sense of relief. Tyler had finally said out loud what his behavior had been communicating for months. Our marriage wasn't struggling because of my career or my failure to be the perfect wife. It was failing because Tyler had fallen in love with one version of me and decided he wanted to be married to someone entirely different. Maybe it was, I agreed softly. Tyler stared at me, clearly surprised by my calm acceptance of his statement. So what are you saying? You want a divorce? The word hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. Divorce meant admitting that 5 years of marriage, years of trying to build a life together, had been built on a foundation that couldn't support the weight of our different dreams. I'm saying I can't be the woman you want me to be, I said. And you can't be the husband I need you to be. Maybe we're both just incompatible. Tyler was quiet for a long moment, processing the finality in my words. When he spoke again, his voice carried a coldness I'd never heard before. Fine, but don't expect this to be easy, Rach. Don't expect me to just walk away and pretend the last 5 years didn't happen. There was something threatening in his tone, a suggestion that Tyler didn't plan to handle our separation with grace or fairness. I thought about our joint bank accounts, our shared assets, the house we'd bought together with money from both our careers. Tyler's family had connections throughout Millbrook's legal and business community. If he wanted to make divorce proceedings difficult for me, he certainly had the resources to do it. I don't expect anything to be easy, I said. But I do expect it to be fair. Tyler's smile was sharp, unpleasant. Fair is a matter of perspective, isn't it? Before I could respond, his phone buzzed with a text message. Tyler glanced at the screen, and his expression shifted subtly. Mom wants to know if we're still coming to dinner. She's worried because we're late. I looked at the clock on the mantel, realizing we'd been talking for over an hour. Patricia's Sunday dinners started at exactly 2 o'clock, and it was now almost 3:30. In the Brooks family hierarchy, tardiness was considered almost as serious an offense as missing dinner entirely. You should go, I said. Tell them I wasn't feeling well. Tyler studied my face, perhaps looking for signs of the emotional breakdown he'd expected. What are you going to do? I'm going to think, I said. About what comes next. Tyler nodded curtly, gathering his keys and wallet. At the door he paused without turning around. You know this is going to destroy you, right? Fighting me. Fighting my family. We have resources you can't even imagine, Rachel. Connections you'll never have access to. You think your little nursing salary is going to be enough to rebuild your life. The threat was clear, designed to frighten me into reconsidering my decision. But instead of fear, I felt something unexpected: determination. Tyler had just revealed that he and his family viewed our potential divorce as a war to be won rather than a relationship to be ended with dignity. I guess we'll find out, I said. After Tyler left, I sat in our living room surrounded by the remnants of our life together. Wedding photos smiled down from the mantel, capturing a younger version of myself who'd believed in forever. The furniture we'd chosen together, the books we'd shared, the art we'd collected during happier times. Everything felt like evidence of a story that had ended before I'd realized the final chapter was being written. My phone rang, jolting me from my thoughts. The caller ID showed my mother's number, and I realized I hadn't spoken to Carmen Martinez in over 2 weeks. Nisha, how are you? My mother's warm voice filled the quiet room. I was just thinking about you. Carmen had raised me alone after my father left when I was 7, working 3 jobs to keep us afloat while encouraging my dreams of becoming a nurse. She'd sacrificed her own education to pay for mine, taking pride in my success in ways that Tyler's family never had. I'm okay, Mom, I said, though my voice betrayed the lie. No, you're not. I can hear it in your voice. What's wrong? I found myself telling my mother everything. Tyler's ultimatum, the constant criticism from his family, the growing distance between us, and my decision to choose my career over his demands. Carmen listened without interruption, her occasional murmurs of sympathy or anger punctuating my story. Misha, she said when I finished. This boy wants you to give up everything you worked for, everything we sacrificed for. The way my mother framed Tyler's demand hit differently than my own internal struggle. She saw immediately what I'd been too close to recognize. Tyler wasn't just asking me to quit my job. He was asking me to abandon the dreams she'd helped me achieve, to waste the education she'd worked multiple jobs to provide. His mother thinks wives should prioritize their families over their careers, I explained. Carmen's laugh was sharp, incredulous. His mother married a rich man, and never had to choose between feeding her children and following her dream. Easy to have opinions when you've never faced real choices. The observation stung because it was true. Patricia Brooks had married Gerald straight out of college, moving from her father's house to her husband's, without ever experiencing financial insecurity or professional ambition. Her criticism of my career came from a position of privilege I'd never known. Tyler says I'm being selfish, I said. Selfish? Carmen's voice rose with indignation. Misha, you save lives every day, you help people when they're scared and vulnerable. That's not selfish. That's a calling. And any man who can't see that doesn't deserve you. My mother's fierce defense of my career reminded me of why I'd become a nurse in the first place. Growing up, we'd often relied on the kindness of healthcare workers who'd taken extra time to explain procedures or payment options, who'd treated us with dignity despite our worn clothes and Medicaid cards. I'd wanted to be that person for others, to provide the compassionate care that had meant so much to my family during difficult times. What should I do, Mom? I asked. You should protect yourself, Carmen said without hesitation. If this boy is threatening to make things difficult, you need to be ready. You need a good lawyer, someone who understands what you're dealing with. My mother's pragmatic advice reminded me that I wasn't just ending a marriage, but potentially entering a legal battle with people who had significantly more resources than I did. Tyler's threat about his family's connections hadn't been idle posturing. Gerald Brooks knew everyone who mattered in Millbrook's business community, and Patricia was involved in every important charitable organization in town. If they decided to wage war against me, I needed to be prepared. I love you, Misha, Carmen said before we hung up, and I'm proud of the woman you've become. Don't let anyone make you smaller than you are. After ending the call with my mother, I spent the rest of the afternoon researching divorce attorneys online. Victoria Hayes, the lawyer I'd bookmarked earlier, specialized in high-conflict divorces involving professional women. Her website included testimonials from clients who'd successfully protected their careers and assets, despite facing intimidation from wealthy spouses. One testimonial particularly caught my attention. Victoria helped me understand that my husband's threats were designed to frighten me into accepting an unfair settlement. She taught me to document everything, and prepare for the possibility that the man I'd married might become someone I didn't recognize during divorce proceedings. The words felt prophetic, describing exactly what I feared might happen with Tyler. The man who'd issued ultimatums and threats bore little resemblance to the supportive partner I'd married, and I suspected the divorce process might reveal even more unpleasant aspects of his character. I was still reading legal websites when Tyler returned home around 8 o'clock. His face was flushed from what I assumed was wine with dinner, and his expression carried the self-righteous satisfaction I'd learned to associate with his parents' validation of his opinions. How was dinner? I asked, closing my laptop. Enlightening, Tyler said, loosening his Mom and Dad had some interesting perspectives on our situation. The formal way he referred to our marriage crisis as our situation told me everything I needed to know about how the Brooks family viewed my decision to keep my job. I'm sure they did, I said carefully. Tyler sat down across from me, his posture suggesting he was about to deliver a prepared speech. They think you're having some kind of crisis, some kind of feminist awakening that's making you forget what's really important. The phrase feminist awakening dripped with disdain, as if wanting equality in my marriage was a character defect rather than a reasonable expectation. And what do you think is really important, Tyler? Family, he said, immediately. Commitment. Understanding that marriage is about building something bigger than yourself, not pursuing your own selfish interests. The irony of Tyler lecturing me about selfishness while demanding I abandon my career for his comfort was almost amusing. I wondered if he could hear the contradiction in his own words, or if the Brooks family echo chamber had made him genuinely believe that only my sacrifices counted as evidence of commitment. Did your parents suggest any specific ways I should demonstrate my commitment to our marriage? I asked. Tyler's expression became cautious, as if he sensed a trap in my question. They think you should take some time to really consider what you're throwing away. What we're throwing away. Time? I repeated. How much time? They've offered to let you stay at their guest house for a few weeks, to give you space to think without the pressure of work and daily responsibilities. The suggestion was so transparently manipulative that I almost laughed. Patricia and Gerald wanted to isolate me from my support systems, surround me with their influence, and wear down my resistance through constant exposure to their version of what marriage should look like. They want me to move out of our house and into their guest house so I can think about whether I want to save our marriage, I said slowly. They want to help, Tyler insisted. They care about both of us. They want to control me, I correct. They want to remove me from my normal environment and subject me to weeks of their version of marriage counseling. Tyler's face hardened. Everything is always a conspiracy with you, isn't it, Rachel? People can't just care about our relationship without having some ulterior motive. People who cared about our relationship would encourage us to work together to solve our problems, I said. They wouldn't suggest separating me from my job and my support system to pressure me into submission. The word submission hung in the air between us, and I realized it perfectly captured what Tyler and his family actually wanted from me. Not compromise or partnership, but complete surrender to their vision of what my role should be. Tyler stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. You know what, Rachel? I'm done trying to save this marriage. If you want to throw away 5 years for your precious career, that's your choice, but don't expect me to make it easy for you. The threat I'd heard earlier was back, clearer now and more specific. Tyler wasn't just angry about my decision, he was planning to punish me for it. What exactly does that mean? I asked. Tyler's smile was cold, calculating. It means you're about to learn what happens when you go to war with the Brooks family. It means you're going to discover that your little nursing salary and your stubborn independence aren't going to be enough to protect you from the consequences of your choices. Before I could respond, Tyler headed toward the stairs, pausing only to deliver one final threat. Dad's lawyer is Richard Sterling. Ever heard of him? He's handled divorces for half the wealthy families in Connecticut. He doesn't lose, Rachel, and he especially doesn't lose to people who think they can take advantage of the Brooks family's generosity. Sterling. The name was familiar from newspaper articles about high-profile divorces, cases where powerful men had successfully protected their assets while leaving their ex-wives with minimal settlement. Gerald Brooks wasn't just threatening to make my divorce difficult, he was bringing in someone with a reputation for destroying financially weaker opponents. After Tyler went upstairs, I sat in the growing darkness of our living room, processing the magnitude of what I was facing. This wasn't going to be a simple divorce between two people who'd grown apart. This was going to be a coordinated campaign by the Brooks family to punish me for refusing to conform to their expectations. But as I thought about Miss Patterson's grateful smile that afternoon, up at a teenager recovering from his car accident who trusted me to advocate for his care, about all the patients whose lives I'd touched through my work, I knew I'd made the right choice. Whatever the Brooks family threw at me, whatever legal or financial intimidation they attempted, I couldn't abandon the calling that defined me. I picked up my phone and scrolled to Victoria Hayes's contact information. Tomorrow I would call and schedule a consultation. Tonight, I would begin documenting everything: Tyler's threats, his parents' manipulation, the systematic campaign to make me doubt my own worth and judgment. If the Brooks family wanted a war, I would give them one, but I would fight on my own terms, with my own values, protecting the person I'd worked so hard to become. The house felt different as I prepared for bed that night, no longer like a home we'd built together but like a battlefield where the first shots had already been fired. Tyler was in his study, probably calling his parents to report on our conversation, strategizing about their next moves. I lay in bed, listening to the murmur of his voice through the walls, trying to remember when the man I'd married had become someone capable of such calculated cruelty. But maybe the capacity had always been there, hidden beneath the charm and ambition that had first attracted me to him. Maybe I'd just been too in love to recognize the warning signs. Outside, the autumn wind rattled our windows, carrying the scent of dying leaves and the promise of winter. Change was coming whether I was ready for it or not. The only question was whether I'd face it as the woman I'd always been, or allow Tyler's threats to turn me into someone smaller, weaker, more willing to accept whatever scraps of dignity his family was willing to leave me. As I drifted toward sleep, I thought about the young woman who'd graduated nursing school with such hope and determination, who'd believed she could have both a successful career and a loving marriage. That woman deserved better than Tyler's ultimatums and his family's manipulation. She deserved a partner who celebrated her strength instead of trying to diminish it. Tomorrow I would begin fighting for her. Tonight, I would mourn the marriage that had never really existed, and prepare for the battle that was surely coming. Victoria Hayes' law office occupied the top floor of a sleek glass building in Hartford's legal district, its panoramic windows offering views of the Connecticut River and the city's financial center. The receptionist led me through a corridor lined with awards and news clippings, documenting high-profile cases, each one representing someone who'd faced seemingly impossible odds and emerged victorious. Victoria herself was nothing like I'd expected. Instead of the stern, intimidating figure I'd imagined, she was a petite woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair and warm brown eyes that missed nothing. Her handshake was firm, her voice confident but kind as she invited me into her office. "Tell me what brought you here today, Rachel," she said, settling behind a desk covered with legal briefs and family photos. The normalcy of those pictures, children at graduation ceremonies, family vacations, anniversary celebrations, reminded me that even in the midst of legal warfare, life continued. I found myself pouring out the entire story, from Tyler's ultimatum to his family's manipulation, to the threats about Richard Sterling and the Brooks family's resources. Victoria listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad, her expression growing more serious as I detailed the systematic campaign to undermine my confidence and independence. "How long has your husband been making these threats about financial consequences?" she asked when I finished. "Since Sunday night. 3 days ago," Victoria nodded, her pen moving across the page. "And you mentioned your mother-in-law suggested you stay in their guest house to think things over. That's actually a common tactic in cases like this. Isolation from support systems, constant exposure to pressure and criticism, designed to wear down resistance." The clinical way she described Patricia's offer made my stomach clench. I'd suspected manipulation, but hearing it explained as a recognized strategy made the Brooks family's behavior seem even more calculated and cruel. "What about Richard Sterling?" I asked. "Tyler said he doesn't live." Victoria's expression shifted slightly, a mixture of professional respect and personal distaste. "Richard is very good at what he does. He specializes in protecting wealthy clients' assets through intimidation and procedural warfare. His strategy typically involves making divorce proceedings so expensive and emotionally exhausting that the opposing party accepts whatever settlement is offered, just to end the ordeal." The description matched exactly what Tyler had threatened, confirmation that the Brooks family was planning a coordinated assault on my finances and my resolve. "Can I fight him?" I asked. Victoria leaned forward, her voice becoming more intense. "Rachel, I've been practicing family law for 22 years. I've seen Richard Sterling try to destroy good people who had the audacity to stand up to his wealthy clients. Some of them broke under the pressure, others fought back and won. The difference wasn't money or connection, it was preparation and determination." She opened a file drawer and extracted a thick folder, spreading documents across her desk. "Before we talk about strategy, I need you to understand exactly what you're dealing with. The Brooks family owns significant assets in this area: real estate, business investments, political connections. If they decide you're a threat to their reputation or their son's future, They'll use every resource at their disposal. The documents Victoria showed me painted a picture of the Brooks family's extensive influence throughout Connecticut's business and legal communities. Gerald's investment firm managed portfolios for judges, politicians, and business leaders. Patricia served on the boards of 3 major charities and had connections to every important social organization in the region. They're not just wealthy, Victoria explained. They're embedded in the power structure of this entire area. That gives them advantages most people don't have access to. The scope of what I was facing felt overwhelming, but Victoria's matter-of-fact presentation somehow made it less frightening. She wasn't trying to scare me away from pursuing divorce. She was helping me understand the battlefield so I could prepare accordingly. What do I need to do? I asked. First, we secure your assets immediately. Joint accounts, investment portfolios, anything Tyler could drain or freeze. Second, we document everything. Every threat, every manipulation attempt, every piece of evidence that demonstrates the family's strategy. Third, we build our own network of support and expertise. Victoria pulled out a legal pad and began writing. I'm going to give you the names of a forensic accountant, a private investigator, and a therapist who specializes in emotional abuse cases. You're going to need all 3. The term emotional abuse hit me like a physical blow. I'd thought about manipulation, control, and unfair treatment, but I hadn't labeled Tyler's behavior as abuse. The clinical term made everything feel more serious, more real. Is that what this is? I asked quietly. Abuse? Victoria's expression softened with compassion. I hadn't expected from such a prominent attorney. Rachel, your husband gave you an ultimatum designed to force you to choose between your identity and your marriage. When you chose yourself, he threatened financial destruction and enlisted his family's resources to punish you. That's not normal marital conflict. That's systematic emotional manipulation designed to break down your resistance. The validation felt both relieving and terrifying. Relieving because it confirmed that my instincts about the Brooks family's behavior were correct. Terrifying because it meant I was dealing with something much more serious than typical divorce proceeding. The good news, Victoria continued, is that we have several advantages Richard Sterling won't expect. You're gainfully employed with a secure income, which means you're not financially dependent on Tyler or his family. You have no children, which eliminates custody battle. And most importantly, you're prepared to fight instead of just hoping for fairness. Victoria scheduled a follow-up appointment for the end of the week and gave me a detailed list of documents to gather: bank statements, employment records, tax returns, insurance policies, and most crucially, any evidence of Tyler or his family's threats and manipulation attempts. Start keeping a journal, she advised as I prepared to leave. Write down every conversation, every threat, every attempt to pressure or intimidate you. Dates, times, witnesses, if there were any. That documentation could be crucial if this case goes to trial. The drive back to Millbrook gave me time to process everything. Victoria had told me the Brooks family's resources were intimidating, but they weren't insurmountable. Other people had faced similar odds and prevailed. The key was preparation, documentation, and refusing to be intimidated into accepting an unfair settlement. My phone rang as I pulled into our driveway, Tyler's name appearing on the caller ID. The timing felt ominous, as if he somehow knew I'd just spent 2 hours planning my defense against his family's threatened assault. Where have you been? Tyler's voice carried an edge of suspicion I'd never heard before. I called the hospital and they said you weren't scheduled today. The fact that Tyler had checked up on me at work sent a chill down my spine. How long had he been monitoring my activity? What else had he been investigating without my knowledge? I had some errands to run, I said carefully, not wanting to reveal my visit to Victoria's office until I was better prepared for Tyler's reaction. What kind of errands take 4 hours? Tyler pressed. The interrogation felt invasive, controlling in a way that made me realize how much of Tyler's behavior I'd been excusing as normal concern. Partners shouldn't have to account for every hour of their day, shouldn't be subjected to suspicious questioning about routine activity. Personal errands, I said firmly. I'll be home soon. Tyler was waiting in the kitchen when I arrived, his expression a mixture of anger and calculation, that reminded me uncomfortably of his father's political fate. The resemblance between Tyler and Gerald had become more pronounced over the past few days, as if Tyler was channeling his father's approach to handling obstacles. "We need to talk," Tyler said without preamble. "About what? About your future? About what happens next if you insist on pursuing this divorce?" The formal tone made it clear this wasn't going to be a conversation between husband and wife, but rather a negotiation between opposing parties. Tyler had apparently decided that if he couldn't intimidate me into submission, he would try to negotiate terms that favored his position. "I'm listening," I said, taking a seat at our kitchen table where we'd shared so many meals during happier times. Tyler remained standing, a power position that I suspected he'd learned from watching his father conduct business meetings. "Dad's attorney has reviewed our financial situation, the house, the investment accounts, the retirement funds we've built together. You need to understand what you'll be giving up if you force this into a legal battle." The suggestion that I would be giving up assets that were legally half mine revealed how Tyler and his family viewed our marriage. In their minds, everything we'd built together belonged primarily to Tyler, with my contributions being secondary and conditional. "Those are marital assets," I said. "I'm entitled to half of everything we accumulated during our marriage." Tyler's smile was patronizing, the expression of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. "Entitled and actually receiving are two different things, Rachel. Legal battles are expensive, attorney fees, court costs, expert witnesses. By the time everything is settled, there might not be much left to divide." The threat was clear. The Brooks family would make divorce proceedings so costly that I'd exhaust my resources fighting for what was legally mine. It was exactly the strategy Victoria had warned me about, designed to force me into accepting whatever settlement they offered rather than facing financial ruin. "And what alternative are you proposing?" Tyler pulled out a folder I hadn't noticed him carrying, spreading several documents across the table. "Dad's attorney drew up a preliminary separation agreement. Very reasonable terms considering the circumstances." I scanned the papers quickly, my heart sinking as I absorbed the detail. According to the proposed agreement, I would receive a lump sum payment of $50,000 in exchange for releasing all claims to our house, our investment accounts, and Tyler's future earnings. The amount was less than a quarter of what my half of our marital assets should be worth. "This is ridiculous," I said, pushing the papers back toward Tyler. "You're offering me a fraction of what I'm legally entitled to." "I'm offering you a way to end this cleanly," Tyler corrected. "Without years of legal fees, without destroying both our reputations, without the kind of public spectacle that could damage your nursing career." The last threat was particularly insidious, because it targeted something Tyler knew I cared deeply about. Healthcare was a small community in Connecticut, and professional reputation mattered enormously. The suggestion that divorce proceedings could somehow harm my nursing career was designed to make me afraid of fighting for what was rightfully mine. "How would fighting for my legal rights damage my nursing career?" I asked. Tyler's expression became smug, satisfied in a way that made my skin crawl. "People talk, Rachel. Hospital administrators, medical boards, professional licensing agents. They notice when healthcare workers become involved in messy legal disputes. Questions get raised about judgment, stability, ability to handle stress." The implication was clear. The Brooks family would use their connections to spread rumors about my fitness as a nurse, potentially threatening the career I was fighting so hard to protect. It was a particularly cruel form of intimidation because it attacked the very thing Tyler claimed to be concerned about. "You would sabotage my career to force me into accepting an unfair settlement," I said. Not really a question but a statement of horrified understanding. "I would protect my family's reputation," Tyler said. "If you insist on making this a public battle, there will be consequences for both of us." The conversation felt surreal, like negotiating with a stranger who happened to look like my husband. The Tyler I'd married would never have threatened my career, or tried to manipulate me through fear of professional destruction. This man was someone entirely different, someone capable of calculated cruelty I hadn't known existed beneath his charming exterior. "I need time to review this," I said, gathering the papers. Of course, Tyler said, his tone suggesting he believed time would work in his favor. But don't take too long, Rachel. Dad's attorney wants to file preliminary paperwork by the end of the week. After Tyler left for what he claimed was a business dinner, I spread the separation agreement across our dining room table and read through every clause carefully. The terms were even worse than my initial assessment. Beyond the inadequate financial settlement, the agreement included clauses that would prevent me from discussing our marriage publicly, limit my ability to seek additional legal remedies, and essentially gag me from talking about the Brooks family's behavior. I photographed every page of the document and sent them to Victoria's office, with a message explaining Tyler's threats about my nursing career. Her response came within an hour. This is exactly what we expected. Don't sign anything, we'll discuss strategy at our meeting Friday. The validation that Victoria had anticipated this type of intimidation made me feel less alone, but also more aware of how calculating the Brooks family's approach had been. They weren't just angry about my decision to keep my job, they were implementing a comprehensive strategy to force me into submission. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Sophie from Bella Vista Restaurant. Could we meet for coffee tomorrow? I have information about your husband you need to hear. Sophie. I remembered her as the waitress who'd served us during our anniversary dinner at Bella Vista, the upscale restaurant where Tyler's family often entertained business associates. The message was cryptic, but something in its urgency made me respond immediately. What kind of information? I texted back. The kind that could help you understand who you're really dealing with. Riverside Cafe on Main Street, 2 p.m. tomorrow. I agreed to meet, curiosity overriding caution. If Sophie had information about Tyler that could be relevant to our divorce proceedings, I needed to hear it. Besides, Victoria had emphasized the importance of gathering evidence about Tyler and his family's character and behavior. The next afternoon, I arrived at Riverside Cafe to find Sophie waiting at a corner table, looking nervous but determined. She was younger than I'd realized, probably in her mid-20s, with the kind of earnest expression that suggested she was struggling with whether to share whatever information she possessed. Thank you for meeting me, Sophie said, as I sat down. I wasn't sure if I should get involved, but after what I overheard last week, I couldn't stay silent. What did you overhear? I asked. Sophie glanced around the nearly empty cafe before leaning forward and lowering her voice. Your husband has been meeting with a woman at Bella Vista for months, always the same booth, always Tuesday evenings, when you're working your late shift. At first I thought it was business, but the conversations got more personal over time. The information hit me like a physical blow, though part of me realized I wasn't entirely surprised. Tyler's distance, his criticism of my work schedule, his sudden concern about other wives' domestic achievements, it all made more sense if there was another woman providing him with the attention and admiration he claimed I wasn't giving him. What kind of conversation? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. The woman, her name is Diana Whitmore. She works at your husband's firm. She kept talking about how hard it must be for him to be married to someone who never had time for him. How she understood the pressures of building a career and supporting a wife who didn't appreciate his sacrifices. Diana Whitmore. I knew the name from Tyler's occasional mentions of colleagues, though he'd never described her in detail. She was supposedly Gerald's personal assistant, someone who'd been with the Brooks Investment Group for several years. How long have these meetings been going on? I asked. Sophie hesitated before answering. At least 6 months, maybe longer. They were regulars by the time I started working Tuesday shifts. 6 months. That meant Tyler's affair had been ongoing since before his complaints about my career became serious, since before he started demanding I prioritize his needs over my patients. His ultimatum about quitting my job hadn't been about saving our marriage. It had been about clearing the way for his relationship with Diana. Did they ever discuss me specifically? I asked. Sophie's expression became uncomfortable. Yeah, they talked about how you were too focused on work to be a real wife. How you didn't understand what Tyler needed from a relationship. Diana kept saying she could never be so selfish as to put her career before her husband's happiness. The irony was staggering. Tyler was having an affair with a woman who worked full-time while criticizing me for my dedication to nursing. Diana Whitmore was building her own career at Brooks Investment Group, while positioning herself as the understanding woman who would prioritize Tyler's needs over her own professional ambitions. "There's something else," Sophie said quietly. "Last Tuesday they were talking about your anniversary dinner. Tyler mentioned something about giving you a choice, making you see what really mattered." Diana laughed and said she was looking forward to hearing how it went. The revelation that Tyler had discussed his ultimatum with his girlfriend before delivering it to me felt like the final betrayal. Our marriage crisis hadn't been a desperate attempt to save our relationship. It had been theater, performed for Diana's entertainment while Tyler prepared to end our marriage on terms that would benefit his new relationship. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Sophie looked down at her coffee cup, clearly struggling with her decision to get involved. "Because I've watched too many women get blindsided by cheating husbands. Because your husband and his girlfriend talked about you like you were some kind of obstacle to overcome. Because nobody deserves to be manipulated like that." I thanked Sophie and promised to keep her name confidential, understanding that her job at Bella Vista could be threatened if the Brooks family discovered she'd provided information that damaged their case. As I drove home, I felt strangely relieved rather than devastated by the confirmation of Tyler's affair. The knowledge that Tyler had been cheating explained so much about his recent behavior, his sudden demands for changes in our marriage, his willingness to threaten and intimidate me rather than work together to solve our problem. He hadn't been trying to save our relationship. He'd been preparing to end it while positioning himself as the wronged party who'd tried everything to make me a better wife. That evening, I called Victoria's office and left a detailed voicemail about Sophie's information. Tyler's affair changed the dynamics of our divorce significantly, potentially affecting asset division, and certainly undermining any claims he might make about my behavior being responsible for our marriage's failure. Tyler returned home around 9 o'clock, his demeanor lighter than it had been in weeks. He was almost cheerful as he asked about my day, as if the separation agreement he'd presented had already resolved our marital problems in his favor. "Did you have time to review the paperwork Dad's attorney prepared?" Tyler asked casually while making himself a drink. "I did," I said. "It's interesting." Tyler's expression became wary. Interesting that you'd offer such a small settlement to someone you claim to still care about. Interesting that you'd threaten my career to force me into accepting terms that benefit only you." Tyler's cheerful mask slipped slightly. "Those terms are fair considering the circumstance, considering the strain your career choices have put on our marriage." "What about the strain your affair has put on our marriage?" I asked quietly. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Tyler's face went completely white, then flushed deep red. His drink glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the kitchen floor in an echo of the dinner plate that had started this entire confrontation. "I don't know what you're talking about," Tyler said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Diana Whitmore," I said simply. "Tuesday evenings at Bella Vista. 6 months of meetings where you discussed how selfish I was for prioritizing my career over your happiness." Tyler stared at me for a long moment, clearly calculating whether to continue denying the affair or switch to a different strategy. When he spoke again, his voice carried a coldness that made me glad I'd already started divorce proceedings. "So you've been spying on me." "I've been learning who you really are," I corrected. "Just like you advised me to do when you gave me 3 days to think about our marriage." Tyler's expression shifted again, becoming calculating in a way that reminded me of his father's political face. "If you think this changes anything, you're wrong. Diana has nothing to do with the problems in our marriage, the problems that existed long before I met her." The admission that the affair had indeed been going on was almost casual, as if Tyler believed his infidelity was irrelevant to our divorce proceeding. The audacity was breathtaking, but it also confirmed everything I'd suspected about how the Brooks family viewed accountability and consequences. "Actually, it changes everything," I said. "Connecticut is a no-fault state, but adultery still affects asset division and alimony determination, especially when the cheating spouse has been hiding assets and threatening the other party's career." Tyler's confident expression faltered as he realized I'd been doing my own research, consulting with professionals who understood how to protect my interests. The helpless wife he'd expected to intimidate into accepting an unfair settlement was proving to be more resourceful than he'd anticipated. "You think you're so smart," Tyler said, his voice rising with frustration. "You think having some information gives you power. But you have no idea what you're up against, Rachel. This family has been handling difficult situations for generations. We know how to protect what's ours." The threat was clear, but it no longer carried the paralyzing fear Tyler intended. I'd spent the past week building my own support network, gathering evidence and preparing for exactly this type of intimidation. Instead of being frightened by Tyler's threats, I felt energized by the confirmation that everything Victoria had predicted was coming true. "I'm sure you do," I said calmly, "but I'm not some difficult situation to be handled. I'm your wife and I'm entitled to fair treatment under the law." Tyler's laugh was bitter, unpleasant. "Fair treatment? You want to talk about fair treatment after you've refused to compromise on anything? After you've chosen strangers over your own husband?" "I've chosen myself," I said. "Something you apparently did months ago when you started your affair with Diana." Tyler picked up his keys from the counter, clearly preparing to leave rather than continue a conversation that wasn't going according to his script. "Enjoy your victory, Rachel, but remember what I told you about consequences. This isn't over." After Tyler left, I stood in the kitchen surrounded by shards of glass from his dropped drink, thinking about how much my life had changed in just 1 week. 7 days ago, I'd been desperately trying to save a marriage I thought was worth fighting for. Tonight I was preparing for a legal battle against people who'd never seen me as anything more than an obstacle to be eliminated. But I wasn't the same woman who'd been devastated by Tyler's ultimatum. That woman had been isolated, confused about her own worth, willing to consider abandoning her career to save a relationship. The woman standing in this kitchen had allies, evidence, and most importantly, a clear understanding of what she was fighting for. Tyler's affair had actually simplified everything. I was no longer trying to save a marriage or prove my worth as a wife. I was simply fighting for fair treatment under the law, for the assets I'd earned, and for protection from a family that viewed intimidation and manipulation as acceptable tactics. Tomorrow I would meet with Victoria again and share everything I'd learned. We would develop a comprehensive strategy for protecting my interests and exposing the Brooks family's attempts at coercion. I would document every threat, every manipulation attempt, every piece of evidence that demonstrated their true character. The Brooks family had underestimated me, assuming that Tyler's ultimatum would break my spirit and force me into submission. Instead, it had awakened something I'd forgotten I possessed: the determination and resilience that had carried me through nursing school, through the challenges of building my career, through every obstacle I'd faced before I'd met Tyler. They wanted a war, and they would get one, but it would be fought on my terms, with my rules, protecting the woman I'd worked so hard to become. Victoria's office felt different during our Friday morning meeting. The warm autumn sunlight streaming through the windows seemed sharper, more focused, matching the intensity in Victoria's eyes as she reviewed the evidence I'd gathered over the past week. Documents covered her conference table like pieces of a complex puzzle, each one revealing another layer of the Brooks family's strategy. "This changes everything," Victoria said, tapping the photographs I'd taken of Tyler's separation agreement. Richard Sterling thought he was dealing with an isolated, financially dependent spouse who would accept whatever terms they offered. He wasn't expecting someone who would investigate, document, and fight back. The forensic accountant Victoria had recommended, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Chen, had spent 3 days analyzing my financial documents. Her findings painted a disturbing picture of systematic asset manipulation that went far beyond Tyler's recent transfer. "Look at this pattern," Margaret said, pointing to a spreadsheet she'd prepared. "For the past 18 months, your husband has been gradually shifting assets into accounts you don't have access to. Investment transfers disguised as portfolio, rebalancing, business expenses that don't correspond to any legitimate costs, even changes to his retirement account beneficiaries." The scope of Tyler's financial deception was staggering. While I'd been working 60-hour weeks to contribute to our shared future, he'd been methodically preparing for a divorce that would leave me with minimal assets. The timing corresponded exactly with when his behavior toward me had begun to change, suggesting that his affair with Diana and his plans to end our marriage had been developing in parallel. The good news, Victoria said, is that all of this activity creates a clear paper trail. Connecticut courts don't look favorably on spouses who attempt to hide marital assets, and the systematic nature of Tyler's transfers makes it obvious this was intentional deception, rather than normal financial management. Margaret pulled out another set of documents, her expression grim. There's something else you need to see. Your husband has been using joint credit accounts to fund what appear to be personal expenses unrelated to your marriage. Hotel bills, restaurant charges, jewelry purchases that you've never received. The amounts are substantial. The evidence of Tyler funding his affair with Diana using money from accounts I was legally responsible for felt like a particularly cruel betrayal. Not only had he been cheating on me, but he'd been using my financial contributions to pay for his infidelity, while criticizing me for working the long hours that generated that income. Can we recover those funds? I asked. Absolutely, Victoria said with satisfaction. In fact, Tyler's misuse of marital assets for his affair gives us significant leverage. Connecticut courts can order reimbursement for funds used to support extramarital relationships, and in cases involving substantial deception, they sometimes award punitive measures. The revelation that Tyler's financial manipulation might actually work in my favor felt like justice beginning to assert itself. For months, I'd been made to feel like my dedication to nursing was somehow selfish or damaging to our marriage. Now it was becoming clear that Tyler's criticism had been projection, deflecting attention from his own betrayal and deception. What about his threats regarding my nursing career? I asked. Victoria's expression hardened. That's where we draw a very clear line. Threatening someone's professional livelihood to coerce them into accepting unfavorable divorce terms is a form of extortion. If Tyler or his family attempts to interfere with your employment, we'll file for immediate legal protection and potentially pursue criminal charges. The private investigator Victoria had recommended, a former police detective named James Morrison, had been conducting his own research into the Brooks family's business practices and social connection. His preliminary report suggested that Gerald's investment firm had a history of aggressive tactics against former employees and business rivals. 3 different people who've had disputes with Brooks Investment Group reported similar patterns of intimidation, James explained. Professional reputations attacked, business opportunities mysteriously withdrawn, social ostracism organized through the family's charitable and social connections. Nothing explicitly illegal, but a clear pattern of using their influence to punish people who crossed them. The information confirmed my instincts about the Brooks family's approach to handling opposition. They didn't just disagree with people who challenged them, they systematically worked to destroy those people's ability to rebuild their lives independently. Understanding their tactics made me more determined to fight back rather than accept their intimidation. The advantage we have, Victoria noted, is that healthcare is a field where professional competence matters more than social connection. Your reputation as a nurse is based on your clinical skills, your patient advocacy, and your colleagues' respect for your work. That's much harder for the Brooks family to undermine than a business relationship or social stand. Over the weekend I implemented the security measures Victoria had recommended. I opened new bank accounts at a different financial institution, one where the Brooks family had no connections or influence. I changed all my passwords and enabled 2-factor authentication on every account. Most importantly, I began systematically documenting every interaction with Tyler and his family. The journal Victoria had suggested became a detailed record of threats, manipulation attempts, and revealing conversation. Writing down Tyler's exact words when he'd threatened my career, Patricia's suggestions about staying in their guest house, Gerald's lawyer's aggressive settlement terms, seeing it all on paper made the coordinated nature of their campaign undeniable. Monday morning brought an unexpected development. Dr. Martinez called me into his office before my shift began, his expression serious in a way that immediately triggered my concerns about Tyler's threatened interference with my career. Rachel, I received an unusual phone call on Friday afternoon, Dr. Martinez said, settling behind his desk. Someone claiming to represent a law firm suggested that the hospital might want to review your employment file, particularly regarding any issues with professional judgment or stability. The blood drained from my face as I realized Tyler's threats were already being implemented. The Brooks family wasn't waiting for divorce proceedings to begin their campaign against my career. They were moving immediately to pressure me into accepting their terms. "What kind of review?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Dr. Martinez's expression shifted from serious to annoyed, the kind that made me ask detailed questions about who was making the inquiry and why. When the caller became evasive about their client's identity and the specific nature of their concerns, I terminated the conversation and immediately contacted our legal department. Relief flooded through me as I realized that Tyler's intimidation tactics had backfired. Dr. Martinez was not only protecting me but investigating the source of the harassment. "Our legal team is treating this as a potential attempt to interfere with hospital operations through harassment of our staff," Dr. Martinez continued. "They've documented the call and advised all department heads to report any similar contacts immediately. They've also reminded me to tell you that the hospital stands behind its employees against external attempts at intimidation." The institutional support felt like a shield against the Brooks family's threatened assault on my career. Tyler had assumed that a few phone calls from his father's connections would frighten my employers into questioning my fitness as a nurse. Instead, his heavy-handed approach had triggered the hospital's protective protocols and created a documented record of harassment. "Thank you for handling it that way," I said. Dr. Martinez leaned forward, his expression becoming more personal. "Rachel, I don't know what's happening in your personal life, but I want you to understand something. You're one of the finest nurses I've worked with in 20 years of practice. Your patients trust you, your colleagues respect you, and your clinical judgment is exemplary. Whatever someone is trying to suggest about your professional competence is completely contrary to my experience and the hospital's assessment of your performance." The validation from my supervisor felt like emotional armor protecting me against the self-doubt Tyler's criticism had been designed to create. For months I'd been questioning whether my dedication to nursing really was somehow selfish or inappropriate. Dr. Martinez's clear statement of my professional value reminded me that Tyler's complaints had never been based on legitimate concerns. I called Victoria immediately after my conversation with Dr. Martinez, sharing the details of the attempted interference with my employment. Her response was swift and decisive. "This is exactly what we needed," Victoria said with satisfaction. "Tyler and his family just provided us with concrete evidence of the intimidation tactics we've been discussing. Attempting to interfere with your employment creates grounds for immediate legal action." Victoria filed for a restraining order that afternoon, seeking court protection against any further attempts to interfere with my career, my finances, or my personal safety. The legal motion included detailed documentation of Tyler's threats, his family's separation agreement, and the attempted harassment of my employer. "This serves two purposes," Victoria explained. "First, it provides immediate legal protection if they escalate their intimidation tactics. Second, it creates an official court record of their behavior that will influence how the judge views their credibility during divorce proceedings." The restraining order hearing was scheduled for Wednesday morning, giving Tyler and his family less than 48 hours to respond to our legal motion. Victoria anticipated that Richard Sterling would try to characterize our filing as an overreaction to normal divorce negotiations, but the evidence we'd gathered painted a clear picture of systematic harassment. Tuesday evening brought the confrontation I'd been expecting since the legal papers were served. Tyler arrived home from work with the controlled fury I'd learned to recognize as his most dangerous move. He'd moved beyond the casual threats and manipulation attempts into something more focused and potentially volatile. "You filed a restraining order against me," Tyler said without preamble. "Against my family. Do you have any idea what you've just done?" The question carried an undertone of genuine surprise, as if Tyler had believed his intimidation tactics would remain hidden from legal scrutiny. The Brooks family's previous successes in silencing opposition had apparently given them confidence that their current campaign would proceed without consequences. "I've protected myself from harassment and threats," I said calmly, something I should have done weeks ago. Tyler's laugh was sharp, angry. Harassment. You think documenting our private conversations and filing legal motions is going to help you? You think the courts are going to side with someone who violates her husband's privacy and trust? The attempt to reframe his threats as private conversations that I'd somehow violated by documenting them revealed how completely Tyler had lost touch with reality. In his mind, the problem wasn't his behavior but my response to it. Not his attempts at intimidation, but my refusal to be intimidated. I think the courts will side with someone who's being systematically threatened and manipulated, someone whose husband has been hiding assets, funding an affair with marital money, and trying to destroy her career to force her into accepting an unfair settlement. Tyler's face went completely still, a reaction that somehow felt more threatening than his previous anger. Diana told you about our relationship. The casual way he referred to Diana, the assumption that she would be the source of information about their affair, revealed how completely Tyler had mentally separated himself from our marriage. He wasn't angry about being caught cheating, he was annoyed that his carefully orchestrated timeline had been disrupted. Diana didn't tell me anything, I said. Your Tuesday evening dinners at Bella Vista aren't as private as you thought. Tyler's expression shifted as he processed the implications of being observed during his affair. You've been having me followed, I've been gathering information about my own life, I corrected. Information you should have shared with me months ago instead of making me feel like I was failing as a wife while you were building a relationship with someone else. For a moment, Tyler's controlled facade cracked, revealing something that might have been genuine regret. But it was quickly replaced by the cold calculation I'd learned to associate with his father's influence. None of this changes the fundamental problem, Rachel. You chose your career over our marriage. Everything that happened afterward was a consequence of that choice. The audacity of Tyler blaming me for his affair, his financial deception, and his family's intimidation campaign was breathtaking. In his mind, my refusal to quit my job had somehow justified every betrayal and manipulation that followed. The logic was so twisted that I wondered if Tyler actually believed it or if he was simply rehearsing the narrative he planned to present in court. I chose to remain myself, I said. You chose to punish me for that decision by lying, cheating, and trying to destroy my career. Those aren't consequences of my choices, Tyler. They're consequences of yours. Tyler pulled out his phone and began typing, his fingers moving rapidly across the screen. Dad's attorney wants to meet with you tomorrow morning, before the restraining order hearing. One last chance to resolve this reasonably. The timing was clearly designed to pressure me into making hasty decisions before the court could rule on our motion for protection. Richard Sterling wanted to negotiate while Tyler's family still had maximum leverage, before legal restrictions limited their ability to threaten and intimidate. I'll consider it, I said, though I'd already decided to decline any meeting that wasn't conducted with Victoria present. Tyler nodded curtly and headed toward the stairs, pausing only to deliver one final threat. Remember what I told you about consequences, Rachel. This restraining order changes nothing except making everything more expensive and more public. The Brooks family doesn't back down from fights, especially when someone tries to embarrass us with legal theatrics. After Tyler went upstairs, I called Victoria to discuss Richard Sterling's proposed meeting. Her response was immediate and decisive. Absolutely not. Sterling wants to intimidate you into withdrawing the restraining order before the hearing. Any legitimate settlement discussions can happen after the court establishes protection against further harassment. Wednesday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of drizzling rain that made everything feel ominous and uncertain. Victoria met me at the courthouse steps, her professional confidence providing a steady counterpoint to my nervous energy about facing the Brooks family in a legal setting. Remember, Victoria said as we walked through the courthouse corridors, we're not here to negotiate or compromise. We're here to present evidence of harassment and seek court protection. Judge Patterson has a reputation for taking intimidation seriously, especially when it involves attempts to interfere with someone's employment. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lighting that cast everything in harsh, unflattering tones. Tyler sat at the opposing table with Richard Sterling, A silver-haired man whose expensive suit and confident bearing suggested someone accustomed to winning through intimidation rather than legal merit. Patricia and Gerald Brooks sat in the gallery behind Tyler, their presence clearly intended to demonstrate family solidarity and perhaps to observe my reactions under pressure. Patricia's expression was coldly disapproving, while Gerald's face carried the calculating look I'd learned to associate with his business dealing. Judge Patterson was a middle-aged woman with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing as she reviewed the documents both sides had submitted. Her reputation for fairness was balanced by an intolerance for legal gamesmanship that made her an ideal judge for our situation. This motion seeks protection against harassment, intimidation, and interference with employment, Judge Patterson said, looking directly at Richard Sterling. The petitioner alleges a pattern of threatening behavior designed to coerce acceptance of unfavorable divorce terms. How does your client respond to these allegations? Sterling rose with the practiced smoothness of someone who'd argued hundreds of similar cases. Your Honor, these allegations represent a mischaracterization of normal divorce negotiation. Brooks has done nothing more than attempt to resolve his marital difficulties through reasonable discussion and legitimate legal channel. The carefully neutral language was designed to make Tyler's threats sound like standard divorce proceedings, but Victoria had prepared for exactly this type of minimization. She rose to present our evidence with the same professional confidence Sterling had displayed. Your Honor, the evidence shows a systematic campaign of intimidation that goes far beyond normal divorce negotiations, Victoria said, approaching the bench with a folder of documents. The respondent issued explicit ultimatums demanding the petitioner abandon her nursing career, threatened to destroy her professional reputation, and attempted to interfere with her employment through anonymous harassment of her supervisor. Judge Patterson reviewed the transcripts of Tyler's threats, the documentation of his affair and financial deception, and the hospital's report of attempted interference with my employment. Her expression grew increasingly serious as she absorbed the scope of the Brooks family's campaign. Mr. Sterling, Judge Patterson said finally, your client threatened to use family connections to damage the petitioner's nursing career if she refused to accept his settlement terms. How do you characterize that as normal divorce negotiation? Sterling's response revealed the arrogance that had made him successful in intimidating previous opponents. Your Honor, emotions run high during marital dissolution. Statements made in the heat of domestic discord shouldn't be given the same weight as deliberate harassment. The dismissive tone was exactly wrong for Judge Patterson, whose expression hardened as she realized Sterling was minimizing documented threats as mere emotional outbursts. Victoria had been right about the judge's intolerance for legal gamesmanship disguised as reasonable advocacy. Counselor, Judge Patterson said, coldly, threatening someone's livelihood to coerce acceptance of legal terms isn't an emotional outburst, it's extortion. And attempting to interfere with a healthcare worker's employment during a divorce proceeding shows a deliberate pattern of intimidation. Judge Patterson's ruling was swift and comprehensive. The restraining order was granted with provisions that prohibited Tyler, his family, and their representatives from contacting my employer, discussing my professional competence with any third parties, or making any statements designed to harm my nursing career. Additionally, the order restricted Tyler's access to marital assets, pending a full forensic accounting of his financial activities. This court will not tolerate attempts to use economic intimidation or professional sabotage as negotiation tactics, Judge Patterson stated. The respondent and his family are hereby ordered to cease all contact with the petitioner's workplace and to refrain from any actions designed to interfere with her professional activity. The victory felt overwhelming, not just because of the legal protection it provided, but because of the official validation that Tyler's behavior had been inappropriate and potentially criminal. For months I'd been questioning my own perceptions, wondering if I was overreacting to normal marital conflict. Judge Patterson's ruling confirmed that Tyler's actions had crossed clear legal and ethical boundaries. Outside the courthouse, Richard Sterling approached Victoria with the kind of forced civility that barely concealed his fury at losing what should have been a routine intimidation case. This protection order is temporary, Sterling said. When we get to the actual divorce proceedings, your client's going to discover that legal theatrics don't change the fundamental economics of marital dissolution. Victoria's smile was sharp, professional. Miss Sterling, your client just created a documented record of harassment and attempted extortion. I look forward to explaining to the divorce court why someone who threatens his wife's career and hides marital assets deserves anything more than the minimum legal settlement. The exchange revealed that our legal victory had fundamentally shifted the dynamics of the divorce proceeding. Instead of Tyler holding all the leverage through his family's wealth and connections, he was now defending against documented evidence of misconduct that could significantly impact the final settlement. That evening, I returned to a house that felt different, safer somehow, protected by the court's explicit prohibition against further harassment. Tyler had apparently decided to stay elsewhere, giving me space to process everything that had happened and plan for whatever came next. My phone rang with calls from colleagues who'd heard about the courthouse victory through the medical community's efficient gossip network. Martinez called to congratulate me on standing up to intimidation, while several nurses from other departments reached out to offer support and share their own stories of difficult divorce. The professional solidarity reminded me of why I'd chosen nursing in the first place, and why Tyler's demand that I abandon my career had been so fundamentally wrong. Healthcare workers understood dedication, sacrifice, and the importance of advocacy. They recognized that my fight against Tyler's intimidation was also a fight for every professional woman's right to maintain her career despite pressure from controlling partners. Carmen called that evening, her voice filled with pride and relief as I described the day's event. "Misha, you did exactly what you needed to do. That boy and his family thought they could bully you into giving up everything you worked for. Now they know they picked the wrong woman to intimidate." My mother's fierce approval felt like validation not just of my legal strategy but of the values she'd instilled in me from childhood. Carmen had taught me that work was dignity, that education was power, and that no one had the right to demand I make myself smaller to accommodate their insecurities. "What happens next?" Carmen asked. "Now we fight for a fair settlement," I said. "Tyler's been hiding assets and using marital money to fund his affair. The court's going to order full financial disclosure, and he's going to have to account for every dollar he's tried to hide." The prospect of holding Tyler accountable for his financial deception felt like justice beginning to assert itself. For months he'd been positioning himself as the wronged party, the husband whose wife's career had destroyed their marriage. Now he would have to explain to a judge why he'd been systematically hiding assets while funding an extramarital relationship. As I prepared for bed in the house Tyler and I had once shared, I thought about how completely my life had changed in just 2 weeks. I'd gone from desperately trying to save a marriage to successfully defending myself against systematic intimidation. I'd discovered hidden strengths, built new alliances, and learned that I was far more resilient than Tyler's criticism had led me to believe. The woman Tyler had tried to reduce to a submissive wife was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and refused to accept less than fair treatment. Whatever challenges lay ahead in the divorce proceedings, I would face them with the confidence that came from having already survived the worst attempts at intimidation and manipulation. Tomorrow would bring new battles, but tonight I could rest knowing that the court had recognized Tyler's behavior for what it was, and provided legal protection against further harassment. The Brooks family's campaign of intimidation had not only failed, but had created evidence that would influence every future legal proceeding. Tyler had wanted a compliant wife who would sacrifice her identity for his comfort. Instead, he'd awakened a fighter who would use every legal tool available to protect what she'd earned and built. The consequences he'd threatened had indeed arrived, but they were falling on him rather than on me. The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by certified mail while I was getting ready for my shift at the hospital. The return address showed Richard Sterling's law firm, and the weight of the package suggested something far more substantial than a simple legal note. I signed for it with hands that trembled slightly, knowing that whatever Sterling had prepared would represent the Brooks family's response to their courthouse defeat. Inside was a thick stack of legal documents that made my initial separation agreement look simple by comparison. Sterling had filed a comprehensive divorce petition that painted me as an unstable, career-obsessed wife who had abandoned her marital responsibilities, and was now using false allegations to extort an unfair settlement from her devoted husband. The narrative was so twisted, so far from reality, that I felt dizzy reading the carefully crafted lies. According to Sterling's filing, Tyler had been a patient, supportive husband, who had repeatedly tried to address the problems in our marriage, caused by my obsessive dedication to work at the expense of family obligations. The document claimed that my long hours at the hospital had created chronic neglect of spatial needs, and that Tyler's affair with Diana was the understandable result of years of emotional abandonment by an unfit wife. Most disturbing was a section that challenged my fitness as a healthcare professional, suggesting that someone who couldn't maintain basic family relationships might lack the emotional stability necessary for patient care. Sterling was attempting to turn my dedication to nursing, the very quality that made me excellent at my job, into evidence of professional incompetence. The financial claims were equally outrageous. Sterling argued that Tyler's systematic movement of assets had been legitimate financial planning, necessary to protect family resources from my increasingly erratic behavior. The affair expenses were characterized as business costs, with Diana Whitmore described as a business associate, whose relationship with Tyler had developed naturally from their professional collaboration. I called Victoria immediately, my voice shaking with rage as I read portions of the document over the phone. Her response was swift and reassuring. "This is exactly what we expected," Victoria said with calm professionalism. "Sterling's throwing everything at the wall hoping something will stick. The more outrageous his claims, the more desperate he sounds. Judge Patterson is going to see right through this." Victoria scheduled an emergency meeting for that afternoon, advising me to bring copies of everything Sterling had filed. When I arrived at her office, I found her reviewing similar documents with an expression of professional satisfaction rather than concern. "Sterling made several critical errors," Victoria explained, spreading the papers across her conference table. "First, he's contradicting his own client's previous statements. Tyler's original separation agreement acknowledged that your career was established before the marriage, but now Sterling's claiming it was a recent development that damaged your relationship." She pointed to specific sections of Sterling's filing, highlighting inconsistencies that would be obvious to any judge reviewing the case. "Second, he's making claims about your professional competence that directly contradict documented evidence of your workplace performance. Dontanez's statement about your nursing skills, your performance evaluations, your patient advocacy record, all of that evidence makes Sterling's allegations look ridiculous." Margaret Chen joined our meeting with updated financial analysis that revealed even more of Tyler's deception. Her forensic accounting had uncovered additional hidden assets, including a secret investment account Tyler had been funding through systematic overpayments to his own retirement plan. "Your husband has been very clever about hiding money," Margaret explained, showing me spreadsheets that tracked the movement of funds across multiple accounts. "But clever doesn't mean undetectable. Every transaction leaves a trail, and the pattern shows deliberate intent to reduce marital assets available for division." The scope of Tyler's financial manipulation was staggering. Over the course of our marriage, he had diverted nearly $200,000 into accounts I had no knowledge of, money that should have been part of our shared financial plan. The betrayal felt even deeper than his affair because it represented years of systematic deception about our most basic partnership decisions. "The good news," Victoria said, "is that Connecticut courts have broad authority to address hidden assets. When someone tries to defraud their spouse during divorce proceedings, judges can order not just reimbursement, but punitive measures. Tyler's attempts to hide money could actually result in you receiving more than half of the marital estate." James Morrison had continued investigating the Brooks family's business practices and social connections, uncovering information that would prove crucial in defending against Sterling's character assassination. His report revealed a pattern of vindictive behavior toward anyone who challenged the family's interests, including former employees, business rivals, and even charitable organizations that had disagreed with Patricia's leadership style. "The Brooks family has a documented history of using their wealth and connections to punish people who cross them," James explained. "Former employees who've filed workplace complaints, business partners who've refused unfavorable deals, even neighbors who've opposed their property development plans. In each case,
the family used their influence to create professional and social consequences for people who stood up to them. This evidence would be crucial in demonstrating that Tyler's threats against my nursing career weren't idle emotional outbursts, but part of a calculated family strategy for handling opposition. Judge Patterson would see that my fears of professional retaliation were based on documented patterns of behavior rather than paranoid fantasies. The most shocking discovery came from James's investigation into Diana Whitmore's background. Far from being the innocent business associate Sterling's filing described, Diana had a history of relationships with married men in positions of power. Her previous job had ended abruptly after allegations of an affair with a senior partner, and her employment at Brooks Investment Group had begun shortly after Tyler started working there full-time.
Diana Whitmore appears to be what's known in business circles as a professional opportunist, James explained. Someone who cultivates relationships with powerful men to advance her career. Tyler wasn't her first married target. And he probably won't be her last. The information about Diana's pattern of behavior would undermine Sterling's attempt to portray Tyler's affair as the understandable result of my emotional neglect. Instead, it revealed Tyler as the victim of someone who specialized in seducing married men for professional advancement, making his betrayal of our marriage seem even more foolish and destructive. Victoria began preparing our response to Sterling's filing. A comprehensive counter-narrative that would expose the Brooks family's intimidation tactics while demonstrating Tyler's systematic deception. Our strategy would be to let Sterling's outrageous claims speak for themselves while presenting clear, documented evidence of Tyler's misconduct. Sterling's biggest mistake was overplaying his hand. Victoria explained as we worked on our response. He's made claims that are so extreme, so unsupported by evidence, that they'll damage his credibility with the judge. Meanwhile, we have bank records, witness statements, employment documentation, and even audio recordings of Tyler's threat. The reference to audio recordings surprised me until I remembered that Connecticut was a one-party consent state, meaning I could legally record conversations with Tyler without his knowledge. Victoria advised me to start documenting future interactions, building an archive of evidence that would protect me if Tyler escalated his intimidation tactics. The weekend brought an unexpected visit. I was working in the garden behind our house, finding peace in the simple task of preparing flower beds for winter, when Patricia Brooks appeared at our back gate. Her usually immaculate appearance was slightly disheveled, and her expression carried a desperation I'd never seen before. "Rachel, we need to talk," Patricia said without preamble. "This legal battle is getting out of hand. There has to be a way to resolve this like civilized people." The irony of Patricia appealing for civilized behavior after weeks of intimidation and threats was almost amusing, but something in her tone suggested genuine concern rather than calculated manipulation, making me curious about what had prompted this unexpected visit. "What did you want to discuss?" I asked, setting down my gardening tools but remaining at a safe distance from the gate. Patricia glanced around nervously, as if afraid of being overheard. "Tyler's relationship with that woman, Diana. It's not what you think. Gerald and I had no idea how serious it had become until after you filed your legal paper." The admission that Tyler's affair had progressed beyond what his parents knew or approved suggested family tensions I hadn't anticipated. In the Brooks family hierarchy, Tyler's decisions were usually subject to parental oversight, especially regarding anything that might affect the family's reputation or financial interests. "What exactly did you think it was?" I asked. Patricia's expression became pained, revealing cracks in the family unity I'd assumed was absolute. "We thought it was just Tyler working through his frustration about your marriage, a temporary distraction while he figured out how to fix things at home. We never imagined he was planning to leave you for her." The revelation that Tyler had been keeping his parents in the dark about the extent of his affair explained some of the recent family dynamics. Gerald and Patricia had been pushing for my submission to Tyler's demands, while apparently believing that the marriage could still be saved through my compliance with their expectations. "Diana has been very convincing about her intentions," Patricia continued. "She's made it clear to Tyler that she expects marriage, children, the whole traditional package. She's been pressuring him to finalize the divorce quickly so they can move forward with their relationship. The information about Diana's expectations cast Tyler's urgency about the separation agreement in a new light. He wasn't just trying to escape our marriage, he was being pressured by his new girlfriend to prove his commitment by ending our relationship as quickly and completely as possible. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. To Patricia's answer revealed the calculation behind her apparent vulnerability. "Because Diana Whitmore isn't the kind of woman who should be part of the Brooks family. Her background, her motivations, her previous relationships. Gerald's private investigator has uncovered things that make us very concerned about Tyler's judgment." The irony was perfect. The Brooks family had hired their own private investigator to research Diana, discovering the same pattern of opportunistic behavior that James Morrison had uncovered. Tyler's parents were realizing that their son's affair partner was exactly the kind of person they'd always claimed to despise. Someone motivated by financial gain rather than genuine affection. "Gerald thinks Tyler is making a terrible mistake." Patricia, "throwing away a stable marriage with a respectable woman for someone who's clearly using him for advancement. But Tyler won't listen to us anymore. He says we don't understand what real love feels like." The revelation that Tyler was rebelling against his parents' authority for the first time in his adult life added another layer of complexity to our divorce proceeding. The unified Brooks family front that had seemed so intimidating was actually fractured by disagreement about Tyler's choices and Diana's suitability as a daughter-in-law. "What are you proposing?" I asked, curious about where Patricia's unexpected honesty was leading. Patricia reached into her purse and pulled out a sealed envelope. "A real settlement offer. Not the insulting document Richard Sterling prepared, but a fair division of assets that acknowledges your contributions to the marriage. In exchange, you agree to a quick, quiet divorce that allows everyone to move forward with dignity." The envelope felt substantial, suggesting terms significantly different from Tyler's original separation agreement. But I'd learned to be skeptical of any offer from the Brooks family, regardless of how reasonable it might appear on the surface. "I'll need to review this with my attorney," I said, accepting the envelope but making no commitment. Patricia nodded, her expression suggesting she'd expected that response. "Of course. But Rachel, I want you to understand something. Gerald and I never wanted this situation to become so adversarial. We've always respected your professional accomplishments, even if we disagreed with how much time your career required. The attempt to revise history was transparent but not entirely unwelcome. If the Brooks family was genuinely interested in fair resolution rather than continued warfare, it could save everyone significant time, money, and emotional energy. But I suspected their sudden reasonableness had more to do with concerns about Diana than any newfound respect for my position. "There's something else you should know," Patricia said as she prepared to leave. "Diana has been asking very detailed questions about the family's financial situation, investment accounts, property holdings, Gerald's business partnership. She's not just interested in Tyler personally, she's conducting due diligence on the entire Brooks portfolio." The warning about Diana's mercenary interests felt genuine, though it also served Patricia's purpose of undermining Tyler's new relationship. If Diana was indeed calculating the financial benefits of marrying into the Brooks family, it would explain her pressure on Tyler to finalize our divorce quickly. After Patricia left, I called Victoria to report the unexpected conversation and arrange for review of the new settlement offer. Her response was characteristically cautious, but intrigued. "Family divisions often create opportunities for favorable resolution," Victoria said. "If Tyler's parents are genuinely concerned about his judgment and his girlfriend's motivations, they might be willing to pressure him toward a fair settlement to avoid prolonged litigation." That evening, Tyler returned to the house for the first time since the restraining order hearing. His appearance was different, somehow diminished, as if the legal defeat and family pressure were taking a visible toll. He moved through our shared spaces like a stranger, collecting personal items with the mechanical efficiency of someone completing an unpleasant task. "Mom said she talked to you today," Tyler said without looking directly at me. "About the settlement offer." "She did," I confirmed, not volunteering any details about my reaction or intentions. Tyler sat down heavily in one of our kitchen chairs, looking more exhausted than angry. This whole situation has gotten completely out of control. It was never supposed to become this complicated. The admission suggested genuine regret, though I suspected Tyler was mourning the loss of his original plan rather than acknowledging the harm his deception had caused. In his mind, the problems had started when I refused to accept his ultimatum, not when he decided to have an affair and hide marital assets. What did you expect would happen? You gave me an ultimatum, threatened my career, hid money from our joint accounts, and filed legal papers calling me an unfit wife and nurse. Did you think I would just accept all of that without fighting back? Tyler's expression became defensive, familiar patterns reasserting themselves despite his apparent exhaustion. I thought you would realize that our marriage was more important than your job. I thought you would choose us over your need to feel important at the hospital. The fundamental misunderstanding remained unchanged. Tyler still believed that my dedication to nursing was about ego rather than purpose. Still saw my career as competition for his attention rather than an expression of my values and calling. His affair, his deception, his family's intimidation, all of it was justified in his mind by my failure to prioritize his needs above everything else. Tyler, do you understand why I became a nurse? I asked. The question seemed to surprise him. Because you wanted to help people, I guess. Because my mother worked 3 jobs to pay for my education, and I wanted to use that education to serve people who couldn't always advocate for themselves. Because I believe healthcare should be compassionate and patient-focused, and I wanted to be part of making that happen. Because taking care of people during their most vulnerable moments is a calling, not just a career. Tyler listened with an expression of growing impatience, as if my explanation was irrelevant to the real issues at stake. That's all very noble, Rachel, but it doesn't change the fact that you chose work over marriage. You chose strangers over your own husband. The conversation felt like déjà vu, covering the same ground we'd argued about for months. But this time, I felt no urge to defend myself or justify my choices. Tyler's affair and financial deception had proven that his criticism of my priorities had been projection, deflecting attention from his own betrayal of our marriage vow. I chose to remain the person you married, I said simply. You chose to become someone I don't recognize. Tyler's phone buzzed with a text message, and his expression immediately shifted as he read it. The change was so obvious that I suspected the message was from Diana, probably demanding updates on the divorce proceedings, or pressuring him about timeline and settlement terms. I need to go, Tyler said, standing abruptly and gathering the personal items he'd collected. But Rachel, you should seriously consider Mom's offer. It's fair, and it would let both of us move on with our lives. After Tyler left, I opened Patricia's envelope and reviewed the proposed settlement term. The offer was indeed substantially more generous than Sterling's original agreement, providing for an equal division of all marital assets, including the house, investment accounts, and retirement fund. There were no restrictions on my ability to discuss the marriage publicly, no attempts to limit my future legal remedies, and explicit acknowledgement that Tyler's affair had contributed to the breakdown of our relationship. The document also included provisions for Tyler to reimburse the marital estate for funds used to support his affair with Diana, recognition that his systematic hiding of assets had been inappropriate, and agreement that neither party would interfere with the other's professional activity. It was everything Victoria and I had been fighting for, presented as a voluntary agreement rather than a court-ordered judgment. Victoria reviewed the settlement offer the next morning, her legal expertise identifying several subtle provisions that favored my position. This is a very reasonable offer, she said with some surprise. Much more favorable than what we'd typically expect from Richard Sterling. Someone in the Brooks family is very motivated to resolve this quickly and quietly. The motivation became clearer when James Morrison provided updated intelligence about Diana Whitmore's activity. His surveillance had revealed that Diana was simultaneously pursuing relationships with at least 2 other wealthy men, maintaining her options while pressuring Tyler to prove his commitment through a rapid divorce and remarriage. Diana Whitmore is hedging her bets, James explained. She's telling Tyler that she's ready to build a life together, but she's also cultivating backup relationships in case the Brooks family proves too difficult to penetrate. Tyler doesn't know about the other men, but his parents do. The revelation that Diana was playing multiple angles explained the Brooks family's sudden willingness to offer fair settlement terms. Gerald and Patricia weren't just concerned about Diana's character, they were trying to prevent Tyler from making life-altering decisions based on a relationship that might not even be exclusive. There's more, James continued. Diana's previous affair, the one that ended her last job, involved embezzlement from the company where she worked. Charges were never filed because the executive she was involved with covered the losses to avoid scandal, but the information about Diana's criminal background gave the Brooks family even more reason to oppose Tyler's relationship with her. If Diana's pattern included financial fraud as well as relationship manipulation, she represented a genuine threat to the family's wealth and reputation beyond simple social embarrassment. Victoria and I spent the afternoon analyzing every clause of the settlement offer, looking for hidden traps or unfavorable provisions that might not be immediately obvious. Her careful review revealed that the agreement was genuinely fair, providing me with financial security and legal protection, while allowing both Tyler and his family to avoid the public scrutiny of a lengthy court battle. I think you should accept this offer, Victoria said finally. It gives you everything we've been fighting for, and it lets you move forward with your life without years of continued legal warfare. Sometimes the best victory is the one that ends the conflict on favorable terms. The advice was sound, both legally and emotionally. Accepting the settlement would provide me with the financial resources to rebuild my life independently while protecting my nursing career from further interference. Most importantly, it would free me from ongoing entanglement with people who had proven capable of extraordinary manipulation and cruelty. That evening I sat in the house Tyler and I had once shared, reading through the settlement agreement one final time. The terms would give me enough money to buy my own home, invest for retirement, and maintain the financial independence I'd worked so hard to achieve. I would be free to continue my nursing career without fear of interference or retaliation. The phone call to Tyler was brief and businesslike. I'll accept the settlement offer, I told him. Have Richard Sterling prepare the final documents for signature. Tyler's relief was audible in his voice. Thank you, Rachel. I know this hasn't been easy for either of us. The attempt to frame our divorce as a mutual tragedy rather than the result of his choices felt typically Tyler, but I no longer felt any need to correct his self-serving narrative. Let him tell himself whatever story helped him sleep at night. I would be moving forward with the truth and the resources to build the life I deserved. 2 weeks later, I sat in Victoria's office, signing the final divorce papers that officially ended my marriage to Tyler Brooks. The process felt surprisingly anticlimactic after months of legal warfare and emotional manipulation. A few signatures on legal documents, a check representing my share of marital assets, and suddenly I was free to begin the next chapter of my life. You did something remarkable, Victoria said as we concluded our business relationship. You stood up to a wealthy, connected family that was determined to intimidate you into submission. You fought for fair treatment and won. That takes extraordinary courage. The validation felt meaningful coming from someone who'd represented many women in similar situations. Victoria had seen how intimidation and financial pressure could break people's resistance, forcing them to accept unfair terms just to escape ongoing conflict. My willingness to fight back had not only protected my own interests but had also sent a message to the Brooks family that their tactics wouldn't always succeed. Dr. Martinez scheduled a meeting with me the following week to discuss my future at Millbrook Medical Center. The hospital administration had been closely monitoring the situation with Tyler's family, and they wanted to ensure that the resolution of our divorce provided complete protection against any future interference with my professional activity. The entire medical staff has been impressed by how you handled this situation, Dr. Martinez said. Standing up to intimidation while maintaining your professional responsibilities, seeking legal protection instead of just hoping the problems would go away. You've demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and advocacy skills that make you an excellent nurse.
The professional recognition felt like vindication of everything I'd fought to protect. My dedication to nursing hadn't been selfish or inappropriate. It had been an expression of values that my colleagues and supervisors recognized and respected. Tyler's criticism of my career priorities had been a reflection of his own insecurities, rather than legitimate concerns about my professional performance. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my new home, a charming colonial in a quiet neighborhood across town from the Brooks family's sphere of influence. The house was smaller than the one Tyler and I had shared, but it felt more genuinely mine, decorated according to my preferences rather than his family's expectations. The divorce settlement had provided me with complete financial independence and the freedom to make choices based on my own values rather than someone else's demand. I was working the schedule I wanted at the hospital, taking on additional responsibilities that challenged me professionally, and building relationships based on mutual respect rather than conditional approval. Tyler's relationship with Diana Whitmore had ended within 3 months of our divorce, exactly as his parents had predicted. Diana had moved on to another wealthy target after realizing that Tyler's family would never fully accept her and that her other options might prove more profitable. Tyler was reportedly dating again, this time with women his parents found more suitable, suggesting that his brief rebellion against family authority had ended with his return to their control. The Brooks family had learned an expensive lesson about the consequences of intimidation and manipulation. Their attempt to force me into an unfair settlement had not only failed but had also exposed their tactics to legal scrutiny that would influence how they handled future conflict. Sometimes the best victory was indeed the one that taught your opponents to respect boundaries they had previously ignored. Carmen visited that weekend, proud and happy as she helped me arrange furniture in my new home. "You did exactly what you needed to do, Mija," she said, admiring the way I'd organized my kitchen to accommodate both cooking and quiet study. "You stood up for yourself, protected what you'd worked for, and built the life you deserve." My mother's approval meant everything because she understood the stakes better than anyone. Carmen had sacrificed to give me opportunities she'd never had, and my willingness to fight for those opportunities honored her investment in my future. The woman who'd raised me to be strong and independent could see that her daughter had inherited both the courage to stand up to intimidation and the wisdom to know when victory had been achieved. As I settled into my new life, I thought about the young woman who'd married Tyler Brooks with such hope and optimism. She'd believed that love could overcome any obstacle, that marriage was a partnership between equals, that good intentions were enough to build a lasting relationship. That woman had learned hard lessons about manipulation, control, and the importance of maintaining your identity even within the closest relationship.
The woman I'd become understood that real partnership required mutual respect, that love without equality was just another form of control, and that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was refuse to enable someone's worst impulses. Tyler had wanted a wife who would sacrifice her identity for his comfort. Instead, he'd created a woman who would never again confuse submission with love or compliance with commitment. The phone rang as I was preparing dinner, Dr. Martinez calling to discuss a patient advocacy position that had opened up in our cardiac unit. The role would allow me to focus on the aspects of nursing I found most fulfilling, while providing additional opportunities for professional development and leadership. "I immediately thought of you for this position," Dr. Martinez said. "Your experience with patient care, your communication skills, and especially your demonstrated ability to advocate under pressure make you the ideal candidate." The professional opportunity felt like life coming full circle, offering recognition for the qualities Tyler had criticized as character flaws: my dedication to patient advocacy, my willingness to stand up for what was right even under pressure, my refusal to compromise my professional integrity. These weren't selfish traits that damaged relationships, but valuable skills that made me excellent at my job. That night I sat on the porch of my new home, watching the sunset and reflecting on everything that had changed in less than a year. Tyler's ultimatum had forced me to choose between my career and our marriage, but it had also forced me to discover reserves of strength and determination I hadn't known I possessed. I'd chosen myself, and that choice had led to freedom, financial security, professional recognition, and most importantly, the knowledge that I could survive and thrive independently. The woman who'd been so afraid of losing Tyler's approval had learned that her own approval was the only validation that truly mattered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but I would face them with confidence earned through surviving the worst attempts at intimidation and manipulation. Tyler Brooks had tried to break my spirit and force me into submission. Instead, he'd discovered that some people couldn't be broken, only awakened to their own power. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and I made a wish for all the women who might face similar ultimatums from controlling partners. I wished them the courage to choose themselves, the resources to fight for fair treatment, and the wisdom to recognize that love never demands the sacrifice of identity. My story wasn't just about divorce or career versus marriage. It was about understanding your own worth and refusing to accept less than you deserved, regardless of the consequences. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you could tell someone who wanted to control you was a simple, powerful word, no. The notification appeared on my phone at exactly 3:47 on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing patient charts in the cardiac unit. A news alert from the Hartford Business Journal, with a headline that made my breath catch: Brooks Investment Group under federal investigation for client fund irregularity. I clicked the link with trembling fingers, reading the article that detailed a Securities and Exchange Commission probe into Gerald Brooks's firm for potential violations involving client account management. Federal investigators were examining allegations that the firm had been charging unauthorized fees and making questionable investment decisions that benefited the Brooks family's personal portfolio at the expense of client returns. The irony was exquisite. Gerald Brooks, who had threatened to destroy my reputation through his business connections, was now facing scrutiny from federal regulators who didn't care about his local influence or social standing. The man who had orchestrated a campaign to intimidate me into accepting an unfair divorce settlement was discovering that some authorities couldn't be bought, threatened, or manipulated. Martinez found me in the break room 20 minutes later, staring at my phone with what he later described as an expression of profound satisfaction mixed with disbelief. "Everything all right, Rachel?" he asked, settling into the chair across from me with his afternoon coffee. I showed him the article, watching his eyebrows rise as he absorbed the implications. "That's Tyler's father, isn't it? The one who tried to interfere with your employment here." "The very same," I confirmed. "Apparently karma has better timing than I expected." Doc Martinez chuckled, but his expression quickly became more serious. "Federal investigations like this don't happen overnight. The SEC must have been building a case for months, maybe years. Your former in-laws were dealing with much bigger problems than your divorce while they were trying to intimidate you." The observation put the Brooks family's desperation during our legal battle into a new perspective. Gerald and Patricia hadn't just been concerned about family reputation or Tyler's choice in romantic partner. They'd been facing the possibility of federal criminal charges, while simultaneously trying to control a divorce proceeding that threatened to expose their tactics to additional legal scrutiny. My phone buzzed with a text from Victoria Hayes. "Saw the news about Brooks Investment Group. Interesting timing, don't you think? Call me when you have a chance." Victoria's office was buzzing with activity when I arrived that evening after my shift. Several of her associates were researching the federal investigation, trying to understand its potential impact on clients who'd had dealings with the Brooks family during their own legal proceeding. "This explains a lot about their behavior during your case," Victoria said, spreading newspaper clippings and legal documents across her conference table. "Desperate people make desperate choices, and the Brooks family was facing existential threats to their business and reputation while fighting your divorce." The SEC investigation had apparently been triggered by complaints from several high-profile clients who'd noticed discrepancies in their account statement. When federal investigators began examining the firm's records, they'd discovered a systematic pattern of unauthorized fee assessments and investment manipulation that had been generating substantial profits for the Brooks family's personal account. Gerald Brooks had been skimming from client portfolios for at least 5 years, Victoria explained, reading from the federal complaint. "Small amounts from each account, but when you multiply it across hundreds of wealthy clients, the total theft was in the millions." The scale of Gerald's financial crimes made Tyler's relatively minor asset hiding seem almost quaint by comparison. While Tyler had been systematically moving money out of our joint accounts to fund his affair, His father had been stealing from the investment portfolios of some of Connecticut's wealthiest families. There's something else, Victoria said, pulling out a folder I hadn't noticed. James Morrison continued monitoring the Brooks family even after your divorce was finalized. Professional curiosity, he said. His surveillance uncovered some interesting connections between Gerald's business troubles and Diana Whitmore. The mention of Tyler's former girlfriend surprised me. I'd assumed Diana had simply moved on to another wealthy target after her relationship with Tyler ended, but apparently her involvement with the Brooks family had been more complex than anyone had realized. Diana Whitmore had inside access to Brooks Investment Group's client information through her position as Gerald's personal assistant, Victoria explained. She was also romantically involved with at least two of the firm's major clients while she was seeing Tyler. James believes she was providing information to competitors and possibly to federal investigators in exchange for immunity. The revelation that Diana had been a federal informant while conducting affairs with multiple men connected to Brooks Investment Group was stunning in its audacity. She hadn't just been manipulating Tyler for personal advancement. She'd been gathering intelligence for law enforcement while positioning herself to avoid prosecution for her own involvement in Gerald's schemes. Tyler never knew any of this, Victoria continued. He thought he was having an affair with his father's assistant. He had no idea she was systematically documenting the family's criminal activities and providing evidence to federal authorities. The irony was breathtaking. Tyler had destroyed our marriage for a woman who was ultimately responsible for destroying his family's business and reputation. His great love affair had been nothing more than an intelligence-gathering operation conducted by someone who viewed him as a useful source of information rather than a romantic partner. What happens now? I asked. Victoria's smile was sharp, professional. Now the Brooks family discovers what it's like to be investigated by people who can't be intimidated, bribed, or socially pressured. Federal prosecutors don't care about local connections or charitable board membership. They care about evidence, and Diana Whitmore apparently provided them with years' worth of documentation. The news about the federal investigation spread quickly through Millbrook's social and business community. Patricia Brooks was quietly removed from several charitable boards as organizations distanced themselves from the growing scandal. Gerald's golf club membership was suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. Tyler was reportedly struggling to find new employment as word spread about his family's legal troubles. The complete reversal of the Brooks family's social standing felt like cosmic justice for their treatment of me during our divorce proceeding. The people who had wielded their wealth and connections as weapons against anyone who opposed them were now discovering how quickly those same connections could disappear when scandal arose. Carmen called that evening, her voice filled with satisfaction as she discussed the news reports about Gerald's arrest. Mija, do you remember what I told you about people who think their money makes them untouchable? Sometimes the universe has its own way of teaching lessons. My mother's observation captured something profound about the Brooks family's downfall. Their sense of entitlement and immunity from consequences had led them to believe they could threaten and manipulate anyone who challenged their authority. The federal investigation was proving that some authorities couldn't be bought or intimidated, regardless of how much local influence a family possessed. 6 months after the SEC investigation became public, Gerald Brooks pleaded guilty to multiple counts of investment fraud and was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Patricia was forced to sell their mansion and most of their assets to pay restitution to defrauded clients. Brooks Investment Group was dissolved, its remaining assets distributed among the victims of Gerald's systematic theft. Tyler's attempts to rebuild his career were complicated by his association with the family scandal. Most Connecticut financial firms were reluctant to hire someone whose father was a convicted felon, especially in a case involving client trust and fiduciary responsibility. The Brooks family name, once a source of social cachet and business advantage, had become a liability that followed Tyler wherever he tried to establish himself professionally. The final irony came 18 months after our divorce was finalized. Tyler called me on a Thursday evening, his voice carrying a humility I'd never heard during our marriage. "Rachel, I owe you an apology," Tyler said without preamble, "for everything. The ultimatum, the threats, the way my family treated you. I've had a lot of time to think about what really happened between us, and I understand now that you were never the problem." The admission felt surreal coming from someone who had spent months blaming me for every issue in our relationship. Tyler's belated recognition that his behavior had been inappropriate came too late to matter for our marriage, but it provided a kind of closure I hadn't expected to receive. "What made you realize that?" I asked. Tyler was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Watching my father get arrested for stealing from people who trusted him, seeing my mother lose everything she'd built through manipulation and social climbing, understanding that Diana used me to gather information that destroyed my family. It made me realize that the people I'd been taking advice from weren't exactly moral authorities." The conversation lasted nearly an hour, with Tyler acknowledging specific incidents of manipulation and intimidation that he'd previously justified as normal marriage dynamic. He admitted that his affair with Diana had begun months before his ultimatum about my career, that his criticism of my nursing dedication had been deflection from his own guilt about cheating. "I convinced myself that you were the selfish one," Tyler said, "that your career was destroying our marriage, but really, I was just looking for excuses to justify what I was already planning to do. Diana made me feel like I was the victim in our relationship, like you were holding me back instead of supporting me." The belated insight into Tyler's motivations provided context I hadn't possessed during our marriage. His increasingly unreasonable demands hadn't been attempts to save our relationship, but preparations for ending it in a way that made him feel like the wronged party rather than the betrayer. "I know it's too late for us," Tyler continued, "and I know I don't deserve forgiveness for how I treated you, but I wanted you to know that I understand now that you were a good wife, a good person, and a good nurse. Everything I criticized you for was actually everything that made you worth loving." The conversation ended with Tyler wishing me well and expressing hope that I'd found the happiness and respect I deserved. His words carried the weight of genuine remorse, suggesting that his family's downfall had forced him to confront truths about himself and his behavior that he'd been avoiding throughout our marriage. After hanging up, I sat in my garden behind my new home, processing the unexpected apology and what it meant for my own healing. Tyler's acknowledgement of his wrongs didn't change the past or undo the damage his ultimatum had caused, but it did provide validation that my perceptions during our marriage had been accurate. The woman Tyler had criticized as selfish and career-obsessed had been fighting to maintain her identity and integrity in the face of systematic manipulation. The nurse he'd demanded become a traditional housewife had been providing compassionate care to vulnerable patients, while contributing substantially to their shared financial security. The wife he'd accused of neglecting his needs had been trying to balance professional responsibilities with a marriage that was being undermined by his secret affair. Dr. Martinez had been right during our first conversation about Tyler's interference with my employment. My dedication to nursing, my willingness to advocate for patients, my refusal to compromise my professional integrity, these weren't character flaws that damaged relationships, but valuable qualities that made me excellent at my job and worthy of respect as a partner. The patient advocacy position I'd accepted had evolved into a leadership role that allowed me to influence hospital policies around patient care and staff support. My experience surviving intimidation and manipulation had made me particularly effective at advocating for vulnerable patients and supporting colleagues facing difficult family situations. The Brooks family's downfall had become a cautionary tale within Connecticut's business and social communities about the dangers of believing wealth provided immunity from consequence. Their systematic intimidation of opponents, their manipulation of social and business connections, their sense of entitlement to special treatment, all of it had contributed to a culture of ethical blindness that ultimately enabled Gerald's criminal behavior. Diana Whitmore had disappeared into federal witness protection after providing testimony that secured convictions against several other financial executives who'd been involved in similar schemes. Her systematic manipulation of wealthy men hadn't been just personal opportunism, but part of a larger intelligence-gathering operation that exposed widespread corruption within Connecticut's investment community. The final chapter of my story with the Brooks family came 2 years after our divorce, when Patricia approached me in the parking lot outside Millbrook Medical Center. She looked older, worn down by the stress of her family's legal troubles and social ostracism,
but her expression carried a dignity I'd never seen during our previous interactions. "Rachel, I know I'm probably the last person you want to see," Patricia said, her voice quiet and uncertain, "but I wanted to thank you for not talking to the reporters who've been calling about our family situation." Several journalists had indeed contacted me during the height of the federal investigation, seeking insider perspective on the Brooks family's character and behavior. I declined all interviews, partly out of respect for legal boundaries, but mostly because I'd moved beyond needing public vindication for their treatment of me. "Your family's legal troubles have nothing to do with me," I said simply. "I have no interest in adding to your difficulty." Patricia nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "You're a better person than we deserved. Gerald and I taught Tyler that people like you were somehow less worthy of respect because you didn't come from our social circle. We were wrong about everything that mattered." The conversation was brief, but Patricia's acknowledgement of her family's prejudice and manipulation provided another piece of closure I hadn't known I needed. The people who had spent months trying to make me doubt my own worth were finally admitting that their judgment had been corrupted by arrogance and entitlement. As I watched Patricia drive away in her modest sedan, a far cry from the luxury vehicles the Brooks family had once considered necessary for maintaining their image, I felt a profound sense of completion. The story that had begun with Tyler's ultimatum about cooking or leaving had ended with his family's complete transformation and his recognition of my worth. The young woman who had been so devastated by her husband's demand that she choose between her career and her marriage, had evolved into someone who understood that the choice had never been about cooking or nursing. It had been about whether she would allow someone else's insecurities and prejudices to define her value and limit her potential. Standing in the parking lot where I'd once been threatened with professional destruction, surrounded by colleagues who respected my judgment and administrators who valued my advocacy, I realized that Tyler's ultimatum had been the greatest gift he could have given me. Not because it had freed me from an unhappy marriage, but because it had forced me to discover reserves of strength and determination I hadn't known I possessed. The woman who had been afraid of losing Tyler's approval had learned that her own approval was the only validation that truly mattered. The nurse who had been criticized for caring too much about her patients had found a career path that celebrated those same qualities. The wife who had been made to feel selfish for maintaining her identity had built a life that honored both her professional calling and her personal value. Carmen visited that weekend to help me plant new flowers in my garden, a spring ritual we'd established to celebrate renewal and growth. As we worked together in the soil, she reflected on how much my life had changed since Tyler's ultimatum had forced me to choose between diminishing myself and fighting for my worth. "You know what I'm proudest of?" Carmen said, carefully transplanting seedlings that would bloom throughout the summer. "Not that you won the legal battle or got a fair settlement. I'm proud that you never forgot who you were, even when people you loved were telling you that person wasn't good enough." My mother's words captured the essence of what I'd learned through the ordeal of my marriage's end. Loving someone shouldn't require sacrificing your identity or compromising your value. Real partnership meant finding someone who celebrated your strengths, rather than demanding you diminish them for their comfort. The phone rang as we finished our gardening. "Martina's calling to discuss an opportunity to speak at a nursing conference about patient advocacy and professional resilience." My experience surviving workplace intimidation while maintaining clinical excellence had apparently resonated with healthcare administrators facing similar challenges with staff support and retention. "Your story about standing up to external pressure while continuing to provide excellent patient care could be really valuable for other nurses facing similar situations," Dr. Martinez explained. "Too many healthcare workers accept unfair treatment because they're afraid fighting back will somehow damage their career. The opportunity to share my experience with other nurses felt like the perfect culmination of everything I'd learned about advocacy, resilience, and the importance of refusing to accept less than fair treatment. My story could encourage other women to recognize their own worth and fight for the respect they deserved, both professionally and personally." That evening, I sat on my porch watching the sunset and thinking about the path that had led me from Tyler's ultimatum to this moment of peace and professional recognition. The woman who had been so afraid of losing everything had discovered that the only thing truly worth keeping was her own integrity and self-respect. Tyler Brooks had given me 3 days to choose between cooking and leaving. I had chosen something he'd never offered as an option, choosing that choice had led to a divorce that freed me from manipulation, a legal victory that protected my career, and ultimately a life that honored both my professional calling and my personal value. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and I thought about all the women who might be facing similar ultimatums from partners who confused control with love. I hoped they would find the courage to recognize that true partnership never demanded the sacrifice of identity, that love worthy of the name celebrated rather than diminished the beloved. My story wasn't just about divorce or career versus marriage. It was about understanding that some choices reveal character rather than create it, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst impulses, and that the person most worth choosing is always yourself. Tyler had said, "Cook or leave," expecting me to choose cooking. Instead, I had chosen freedom, dignity, and the right to remain the woman I'd worked so hard to become. The consequences he'd threatened had indeed arrived, but they had fallen on him and his family rather than on me. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you could tell someone who wanted to control you was a simple, powerful word, no. And sometimes that single word was enough to change everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.